Well, welcome to Chapter 7. And in Chapter 7, we're going to be learning the last two cases, the genitive and the dative. There's basically four cases in Greek. In the last chapter, we learned the nominative and the accusative for subjects and direct objects. And so in this chapter, it's the genitive and the dative. There actually is a fifth case in Greek. It's called the vocative case. It's a lot like the nominative, and we'll look at it later on. But for the most part, people are content to say there are four cases in Greek. All right, let's start with English grammar. And there's two things we need to learn for English grammar. The first has to do with English cases. We've already learned two, right? We've learned the subjective case and the objective case. It's what we use in English for the subject and the direct object, among other things. Well, there's a third case in English called the possessive case. And as you would expect, this is the form that a word takes to show possession. And there's two ways to put a word into its possessive case in English. One is to use the word of. So we might say something like the love of God. Okay, of God is possessive. The other way to do it is to use the apostrophe S construction. And we can say God's, apostrophe S, love. But whether we say the love of God or God's love, they're both possessive. And it's how we form the possessive case. Okay, so those are the three cases in English. The other thing I need to make sure it's clear in English grammar still is what is an indirect object. Now, we learned in the last chapter that a direct object is a word that directly receives the action of the verb. So if you say Karen threw Brad, Brad's a direct object, meaning he is what's being thrown. Karen, his sister, is throwing him. He's a direct object. But there's an indirect object also. And the indirect object is the word that is indirectly involved in the action of the verb. It doesn't directly receive the action of the verb, but is still involved in it. That's the indirect object. So let me change my silly example a little. In case you're wondering, Brad was one of my first TAs in Greek and helped me write basics of biblical Greek. So that's why I tend to use them in illustrations. If I took the example, Karen threw Brad, and I changed it to Karen threw Brad a ball, what's the direct object? Well, see, it's not Brad because Brad isn't being thrown anymore. The direct object is ball. So what's Brad? Well, Brad is the indirect object. He's involved in the action of the verb because the direct object, the ball, is being thrown to him, but he is not directly receiving the action of the verb. An easy way to identify an indirect object is to put the word to in front of it, to, and to see if it makes any sense. So Karen threw Brad a ball. Karen threw to Brad a ball. Oh, if that makes sense, then this word, Brad, is the indirect object. Now, in English grammar, once you put the to in there, it's no longer the indirect object, it's a prepositional phrase, but it gives you the idea that that's how you can identify an indirect object. So the indirect object is the word that is indirectly connected with the action of the verb. You can identify it by putting the word to in front of it. And the thing is, in English, we use the objective case for both direct objects and indirect objects. We use the objective case. What we're going to find in Greek is that they have a different case for indirect objects. We'll get to that in just a second. Okay, let's move on to Greek grammar. And the first of the cases we're going to look at in this chapter is the genitive case. And as you might expect, the genitive case, among other things, is used to indicate possession. So if you wanted to say love of God, then you're going to put of God in the genitive case. Now, how would you put of God in the genitive case? Well, you're going to put, as you would expect, genitive case endings on the end. So theos is the nominative for God, and if you're going to put it in the genitive, you just change it to theou. You put an upsilon at the end. So that's what's going on in the genitive case. To show possession, you show possession by putting a word into the genitive case. You put something into the genitive case by sticking a genitive case ending on it. Now, the other technical word, grammatical word you need to learn is head noun. The head noun is the word that the genitive is modifying. So if you said love of God, of God is the genitive, love is the head noun. Okay? So head noun, genitive. One of the things that's kind of nice is that genitives tend to follow their head noun. And what that means is that when you're translating along, you come along and you see the word for love, you can't stop and just say love. You've got to look and see if there's a genitive beyond it. And if there's a genitive beyond it, if there's a genitive modifying it, then you've got to look at it as a unit and translate it. To help you do this, let me introduce a really important, at least I think it's important, idea that I came up with, and that is keywords. And a keyword is simply a word that you connect with a certain case. And the keyword is to help drive the meaning of the case into your memory. Now, on down the line, 6, 7, 10 chapters, check with your teacher. Your teacher may not care if you keep using keywords all the time, but certainly right now up front, it's important to use keywords. So here's what I mean by that. The keyword of the genitive is of. Now, you're going to find out the genitive can mean other things than of, but for now, that's what we're looking at. What this means is that when you find a genitive, you just automatically say of before you translate it. So if you see theou, you wouldn't just say God, you would say of God. And the keyword of will just drive the significance of the genitive case into your memory. Okay, so when you see the genitive, think of the keyword of and include that in your translation. Okay, that's it for the genitive. You'll find out that the genitive is very flexible, and especially when you get into second year Greek, there's all kinds of stuff that you can do with the genitive. Often make good term papers, sometimes even make good sermons, but that's for later. Okay. The fourth and final case we're going to look at is the dative case, the dative case. It's a little hard to define what the dative case is. What's easy is to say, here are the keywords connected with the dative case. And there's actually a lot of keywords that we could connect with the dative case, but let me give you 3. And I chose these 3 because they're 3 of the most important. They're also the 3 you need for your workbook exercises for the chapter. But the keywords that I want you to learn for the dative are to, in, and with. Okay? To, in, and with. And what that means is when you come across and you come to a word that's in the dative, let's say theo, which would be the dative form of God. When you see theo, you're going to have to look at the context and say, well, what makes best sense? Should I say to God, in God, or with God? And context is your guide. I mean, you're just going to have to look at the context and make that decision. But those are the 3 keywords connected with the dative case. And so, for example, if you saw the angel appeared to him is going to be in the dative. If you saw blessed are the poor in spirit, spirit's going to be in the dative. And if you saw whoever is angry with his brother, brother is also going to be in the dative case. So to, in, and with. So there's one other thing, though, I need to cover with datives, and that is the whole issue of the indirect object. In English, as I said, we use the objective case for both direct and indirect objects. In Greek, we use the accusative for the direct, but if it's an indirect object, as you're guessing, we use the dative case. So if you want to have an indirect object in Greek, that indirect object must be in the dative case. So, for example, if you have this sentence, he would give you living water, what's the direct object? Well, it's water, isn't it? It's what he's giving. But it's being given to you, so you is the indirect object, and Greek will place the word for you in the dative case. Okay, that's basically it for the grammar. And let's pop into some paradigms now, and you can see these endings and how they're working, okay? This is the normal way in which noun paradigms are laid out. And you'll notice, perhaps, that the genitive and dative are in the middle. So the paradigm goes nominative, genitive, dative, accusative. I always thought that was probably the worst way to do it. I would have much rather have been nominative, accusative, dative, genitive. It just makes way more sense, but this particular pattern is so ingrained in Greek teachers' minds that it just wasn't a battle I wanted to fight. But anyway, Nominative, genitive, dative, accusative. And in this case, I'm showing one masculine noun, two feminine nouns, and a neuter noun. So we're familiar with the nominative and the accusative. If you look at a second declension masculine, you'll see that the genitive singular case ending is upsilon. Pop over to the neuter second declension, it's also an upsilon. Well, that's interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. But a first declension feminine is going to have sigmas. Go down to the dative singular. What do you see there? Well, here's your iota subscripts. But two things have actually happened. Let's look at logo. There's two things that have happened. What are they? Well, the first is that the stem vowel omicron has lengthened to an omega. We'll talk about that in a bit. And then the second thing that's happened is that the iota has dropped under it. And we're going to talk about that rule in a little bit as well. But I want you to see that it goes logos, lagu, lago. It's not a totally strange form. The omicron's lengthened and the iota has gone underneath it. You go over to a second declension neuter and you see the same thing, right? Now in a first declension, though, all that you can see at least is that the iota has subscripted. So it's graphe and hora. So there's your singular for first and second declension nouns. Flip over to the plural, lagoi, graphai, erga, and then get down to the genitive. Look how wonderful it is. Lagon, the genitive plural ending is on. The omega swallows up every vowel in its path. Lagon, graphon, ergon. It means the case ending will give you a clue as to the gender or declension, but it makes it really obvious that it's a genitive plural. Look what happens in the dative plural. The endings are, all the time, iota sigma. Now, this is a paradigm that is obvious that you just have to memorize it perfectly. You just have to know these endings. It just has to come off your lips just like that. So I would really encourage you, instead of waiting later and getting behind perhaps, just really making an effort now to really memorize these endings. When I was learning these in college, what I did was I would go into a classroom when there was no class in there, and I'd get out the whiteboard and I would draw a grid. So I'd have my columns for the different kinds of words, logos, graphe, and so forth. And then I would have the cases in the singular and the cases in the plural. And I would just draw this giant grid on the whiteboard. Then I would close my eyes and I would just hit one of the cells in the grid. And what I was trying to do was I'd say, okay, what is the case ending for this? And let's say it's a feminine dative plural. What I didn't want to do is to have to always go through the paradigms in my mind sequentially until I hit the dative plural. You really need to have random access on these case endings. You just need to be able to look at one of those quadrants, one of those cells, and say, okay, accusative plural masculine. Okay, what is that? And don't go through them, just know what it is. I'd really encourage you to do something like that. Maybe draw out a grid on paper that you could just keep writing on. When I was in college, we were still on Mimeo, and so I didn't have the advantage of computer pronounce. But anyway, I've given you a hint at my age. But print out a grid, but the whole point is be random access. Just point at a grid in the table and say, okay, what would be this case ending? Oh, I'm second declension, neuter, genitive singular. Okay, what is that ending? And just force yourself to learn them that well. That is very, very important. The other thing that of all these different endings, you need to pay attention to the sigma. The sigma can be a tad annoying, all right? And let me go back to the paradigms and I'll show you what I'm talking about. When you're looking at the plurals, you can see where there's sigmas. The nice thing is if it's iota sigma, it's always dative plural, so that's simple. If it's omicron upsilon sigma, you know that it's an accusative plural masculine. The problem is the accusative plural feminine graphos, alpha sigma. And here's why it's a problem. Look up at the genitive singular of hora. It's identical in form, isn't it? The accents are different, but the forms are identical. And so this is the challenge on sigmas, that when you see an alpha sigma, is it a genitive singular or is it an accusative plural? And I'm going to give you a rule for that later on. But really spend time on these charts. You know, it's things like when you see the Yoda subscript, it can only be one thing. It has to be a dative singular, right? It can't be anything else as far as you know. And so I would just really encourage you to spend time and to look at, okay, if I see Yoda subscript, it has to be this. When I see a nu, here are the two options that it is, and just really memorize them. Well, that's it for your basic noun endings. Again, there's going to be more, and we have a third declension in chapter 10. But this is the basic set of noun endings. They're going to affect adjectives. And so this is a good number of the endings you have to know. So don't get discouraged as you keep seeing more endings. All right, let's move on to a few other things in the chapter. Definite article. We now have all the forms of the definite article. And you just need to memorize this. It has to be just second nature. When you see a tu, you know what it is. When you see a ton, you know what it is. And when I was first learning the article, I thought of it as a tau or a rough breathing followed by a case ending. It just was my little mnemonic device, so you can, maybe that will help you. You get into the plural and you can see that's basically what's going on. But the definite article is your friend, but you've got to memorize it, and you have to memorize it absolutely precisely. Okay? All right. We've learned 3 noun rules so far. Let's learn 3 more. All right? We're going to learn rules 4, 5, and 6, and let's start with rule 4. Here it is. Noun rule number 4 says that in the dative singular, the iota subscripts if possible. Now that if possible is really important, because when we get into a third declension noun, what we're going to find is that the dative singular ending is still in iota, but it can't go under the preceding letter. And the reason is iota subscript under long vowels. So if you look at first and second declension words, when you go from lagos with an omicron to lago, the omicron lengthening to omega, the omega is a long vowel, so the iota just gets under the omega and it becomes an iota subscript. In the third declension, the letter before the iota is going to be a consonant, and it's not possible for an iota. It's a subscript under a consonant. So the wording in this rule, as is for all the rules, is very important, and you need to learn them absolutely precisely. So again, in the dative singular, the iota subscripts if possible. So you got lago, graphe, hora, and ergo. And the iota subscripting, because in all those cases, that final vowel is long. Rule 5 has to do with something called ablaut. That's the technical name for it. And all that ablaut says is that vowels can change their length. So, noun rule 5 is vowels often, again often, not always, but vowels often change their length. Now, this is what we saw again with logos. So you have logos with an omicron in the nominative and in the genitive singular goes to lago. Now, why did it lengthen? I have no idea. It's one of the mysteries I've never been able to figure out. But it does lengthen. And so, again, you need to keep in your mind, you need to keep omicron and omega connected. Omicron is the short O-class vowel. Omega is the long O-class vowel. And they're going to shorten and lengthen. And this is just not in the dative singular. We're going to see ablaut in lots of other places. In fact, eventually what you're going to learn is that there's a zero form of ablaut, which means the verb completely drops off, the vowel completely drops off. But that's way near the end of the book. But just get used to vowels changing their length, getting longer or getting shorter. All right? All right. Rule number 6. Again, this is something that we saw earlier, so this isn't going to be new, but here's the rule. In the genitive and dative, the masculine and neuter will always be identical. And by identical, I mean they'll have identical case endings. So you have lago, case ending in the genitive singular is an upsilon. Go over the neuter, it's ergu, same case ending. Lago, ergo. Drop down to the plural, lagon, ergon. Dative plural, logos, ergos. You see, in the genitive and the dative, masculine and neuter forms are always going to be identical. They're going to be using the same case endings. So that's it for the next 3 noun rules. Just a couple more to go. They're in, I think it's chapter 10 with 30 declensions. All right, let's look. These are mostly just a couple more odds and ends in the chapter. And there is something called partially declined words. Most words are fully declined. In other words, they're going to have a different form in the nominative and the genitive and the dative and the accusative, unless, of course, it's a neuter. But usually nouns have different forms in each different case and each different number. Otherwise, you can't tell what they're functioning, how they're functioning. But there are some words that are partially declined, which means the same form is used in multiple cases. And a lot of these are foreign loan words that came over from other languages. A lot of them are names, and the names just didn't fully inflect. But you're going to see a word in your exercise, and that's why I have to talk about this, and it's the name for Jesus. If you look at the paradigm for Jesus, it's Iesus in the nominative, it's Iesu in both the genitive and the dative, and then it's Iesun in the accusative. In other words, Jesus' name is partially declined, which means that the same form is used for both the genitive and the dative. Now, at first glance, that may say, well, how will I know whether it's showing possession or it's one of the dative keywords? Well, the nice thing about names is that they're almost always preceded by an article, and the article will be declined. In other words, if you see tu Iesu, the tu is telling you Iesu is genitive. If you see to Iesu, then you know that Iesu is dative because the article is telling. See, I told you that article is your friend, right? All right. So that's what partially declined words are. There's one other declension pattern, though, that I want to show you. And I don't really have a name for it. I tend to call it doxa type words. And I say doxa because doxa is the most common of the words that follow this particular declension pattern. I think there's actually only 3 words that follow this declension pattern that occur more than 50 times. So there's only 3 words that you're going to be learning, at least in BBG, that will have this pattern. But we're going to use doxa as our example. Take a look at the paradigm. In this particular word, look what happens in the singular. Nominative singular is doxa. In the genitive singular, it's doxase. In other words, there's an alpha eta shift in the genitive singular. The eta stays in the dative, and then it goes back to alpha in the accusative, and then in the plural, it's alpha all the way down. Of course, the genitive plural is swallowed up the alpha. So in other words, doxa and a couple of other words have this alpha eta shift. And so you're going to have to know that this is going to happen. Now, here's the main problem, though. If you see a first declension feminine ending in alpha sigma, so here are the 2 different positions on the paradigm. Is it a genitive singular or is it an accusative plural? Because the forms are identical, right? And if you have a hora kind of word, it doesn't shift to eta. It stays alpha all the way through the singular. So Horus, with an alpha sigma, could either be genitive singular or accusative plural. And at that point, what you're going to have to do is just look for some contextual clues, and you can generally figure out what it is. However, if you see alpha sigma on doxa, you know it has to be accusative plural. Why? Because in doxa, the genitive singular is eta sigma. So that's why this distinction is important to know between hora words and doxa kind of words. Now, how will I know if a word is a doxa kind of word? It's going to have an alpha eta shift. Well, you could just memorize them, but let me give you the rule. And I use the English acronym AIR Not Greek, it's just an English sound thing for me. What you do is that you look at the letter before the alpha. And if the letter before the alpha is epsilon, iota, or rho, air, then it's a hora kind of word. And it's going to stay consistently alpha throughout the singular. But if you look at the lexical form of the word, like doxa, and the letter before the alpha is not air, it's not epsilon, iota, or rho, then you know that in the genitive and dative singular, that alpha is going to shift to an eta. Okay? You may have to repeat that rule a couple times to get it down. But that's the rule that we use. Okay, almost done. Hang in there. Let me give you 3 translational hints for this chapter. The first and probably the most important is the whole concept of keywords. So whenever you see a word in the genitive, just automatically put the word of in front of it, okay? If you see a word in the dative, you have the option of to, in, and with. You got to look at the context, and you got to stick in the keyword that makes the most sense in that context. Okay, so that's first translation hint. Second of all, when you hit a noun, you can't stop. You've got to go beyond it to see if there's a genitive. And if there is the genitive, then this is the third hint. Keep the head noun and the genitive together. Keep them as a unit, okay? Love of God. So that's it for translational hints on this chapter. So let's go ahead and move to the summary, and let's see what we have learned. Well, we've learned the genitive and the dative cases. The genitive is the possessive case in Greek, and we would connect the genitive to the head noun by putting the word in the genitive, so it's the love of God. In the case of the dative, when you see a word in the dative, you use the keywords to, in, or with, whatever fits the context in front of them. And we spent a lot of time looking at the different case endings, and you're just going to have to really learn those case endings well. We saw an indirect object is the word that is indirectly connected to the action of the verb. You can put to in front of it, and if it makes sense, that word's probably the indirect object. And in English, we use the objective case for indirect objects. In Greek, we use the dative case for indirect objects. Along with the case endings, as I said, we also looked at the definite article, and you just have to memorize this absolutely perfectly well. And then we learned rules 4, 5, and 6. Rule 4 is in the dative singular, the iota subscripts if possible, and it's only possible if the preceding letter is a long vowel. So that's where you get your iota subscripts. Noun rule number 5 is that vowels often change their length. Omicrons and omegas can go back and forth. It's called ablaut. And then noun rule number 6 is that in the genitive and dative, the masculine and neuter will always be identical, meaning they'll have exactly the same case endings. We also saw the rule for doxa type words, that if the lexical form ends in an alpha and the letter before it is epsilon, iota, or rho, it'll stay consistently alpha in the singular. If it's not epsilon, iota, or rho, if you have a word like doxa, then the alpha shifts to eta in the genitive and dative singular. And we looked at some translation hints. Translation hints are keywords of with the genitive, to, in, with the dative. And then I said, always be sure to check for genitives following a noun. And as you're translating, keep the genitives with the noun. Draw your lines on either side. So that wasn't bad, was it? And so that's the last of the 4 main cases. And we can really work on getting those case endings down. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at the vocabulary. Hamartia, hamartias, hey. Sin. Arche, arches, hey. Beginning, ruler. Gar. For, then. Apin. He, she, it said. Ace. Into, in, among. Exousia, exousias, hey. Authority, power. Euangelion, euangeliou, ta. Good news, gospel. Iesus, Iesu, ha. Jesus, Joshua. Kurios, kuriou, ha. Lord, Master, Sir. May, not, blessed. Uranos, uranu, ha. Heaven, sky. Hutas, haute, tuta. In the singular, this or this one. In the plural, these. Su, you. Huias, huiu, ha. Son, descendant, child. Hoste. Therefore, so that. And by the way, now that we're all done with the cases, the endings that have been on your vocabulary words start to make sense, right? So when you learned logos and it had dash, omicron, upsilon, you know now that's the genitive form of logos. So word is logos, of a word is logu. So make sure that you've gone back through your vocabulary cards and make sure that you're memorizing the lexical form, the genitive form, and the definite article, okay? Make sure all those are together. And in the previous words section, I list those out for you. All right. Well, very good. We're done with cases. Go and have fun with your workbook. Well, welcome to Chapter 8. And in Chapter 8, we're going to be learning two basic things. We're going to be learning about prepositions, and we're going to be learning about a verb, ami. This is not an overly difficult chapter. It's not very long. I thought the last couple chapters were hard enough, so I thought I'd put a couple of easier chapters here and in the next chapter. But we'll look at prepositions and the verb ami. Okay, let's start with English grammar and start with prepositions. What's a preposition? Well, a preposition is normally a little short word, not necessarily, but they're normally short. They're words that show the relationship between two other words. And it's very common to, in order to explain what a preposition is, to talk about a rabbit and the rabbit hole. And what does a rabbit do with his rabbit hole? Well, sometimes he goes into the rabbit hole. Okay, into is a preposition. He comes out of the rabbit hole. Out of is a preposition. He may go around the rabbit hole. Okay, around is a preposition. So that's what prepositions are. They are words that show the relationship between two other words. A lot of prepositions are spatial, like the illustration I just gave. There's other kinds of prepositions too. There are prepositions that are temporal, there are prepositions that are instrumental. Different kinds of relationships, though, not necessarily spatial. Okay? So that's what a preposition is. Now, the word following the preposition is called the object of the preposition. So it's the second word that is the preposition is referring to and showing the relationship between two words. So in those illustrations, rabbit hole was the object. But for example, if I say I'm going to put my foot under the chair, under is the preposition, chair is the object of the preposition. If I'm going to put a piece of paper in my Bible, Bible is the object of the preposition. Okay, so we have prepositions and we have their objects, and then sometimes there are going to be modifiers, like I'm going to put a piece of paper in my black Bible. Okay, my and black are modifiers. That whole unit is called the prepositional phrase. Okay, so the preposition, its object, and any other modifiers. Now, technically speaking, a phrase is a unit of words that have some meaning, but they don't contain both a subject and a verb. But the most common kind of phrase there is a prepositional phrase. Okay, so that's it. Prepositions, objects, and the prepositional phrase. All right? All right. Staying in English, we have something else to learn, and it's called a predicate nominative. It's a little complicated, so hang in there with me. It's complicated because we tend, not always, but we tend to ignore predicate nominatives in English today. And that's why it's going to sound a little weird, but it's still correct grammar. A predicate nominative is something that happens with the verb to be. Now, to be is the infinitive form of the verb. This verb takes many other forms. Am, is, are, was, were. Okay, those are all different forms of the verb to be. And in regular verbs, I hesitate to say regular, but in regular verbs, they describe action, don't they? And that action moves through the verb to its direct object. And so when you have a regular verb, you have to have its object in English, in the objective case, in Greek, the accusative case, for the most part. So regular verbs are words of action that move to a direct object. Well, to be is not that kind of verb. It's called a stative verb. And a stative verb is not a verb of action. It's a verb that describes a state of being. And the way we say it is that Amy, well, that's the Greek version, to be in English. The to be verb is stative in that it predicates something about another word. In other words, it's like it's drawing an equal sign. I'll give you an example. If you were to call me on the phone and say, is Bill there? If I were speaking correct English, I would say, well, it is I. I wouldn't say this is me or it is me. I would say it is I. And the reason is that you have the subject, it, then you have this stative verb, is, and there's no action in the verb is, so it can't be followed by a direct object in the objective or the accusative case. Well, this is where predicate nominatives come in. The word following the is also going to be in English, we would say the subjective case. In Greek, we say the nominative case. For some reason, in English, we call this a predicate nominative. I don't know why. But what the verb is doing is drawing an equal sign, and it's saying it, the person on the phone, is I. Now, you can hear that, and it probably sounds a little strange to some of you, because we tend to ignore, at least we're starting to ignore predicate nominatives now in English. Languages are always changing, and you will generally hear it is me kind of thing. But technically speaking, it's still correct to use a predicate nominative and say it is I. The reason that we use the word predicate, I'm assuming, is that you can break a sentence into major chunks, and the verb and everything following it can be called a predicate. So a predicate nominative is when you get a nominative in the predicate of a sentence. I think that's where it comes from. But anyway, just think, and when you want to know what a predicate nominative is, just think of the example, it is I. It's something that happens with the verb is, and it's drawing an equal sign between the subject and the word that's following it. That word that's following it can't be in the accusative because it's not receiving the action of the verb, because the verb doesn't describe action, it describes state of being. And so in English, we put that word into the subjective case, and as you're going to see, we'll put it into the nominative case in English. Okay? So that is predicate nominative. Okay, let's jump into Greek, and let's go back to prepositions. Greek prepositions function a lot like they do in English, except for one little thing. And there's often just one other thing in Greek, isn't there? All right. There are a group of prepositions whose object will always be in the same case. Now, the object of a preposition can never be in the nominative case, but there are some prepositions whose objects will always be genitive. There are some prepositions whose objects will always be dative, and there are some prepositions whose objects will always be in the accusative. These are the easier prepositions to memorize. There's technical reasons as to why the different cases, and we don't have to worry about that in first year Greek. But for example, let's say you come across the preposition apa. Okay, apa means away from, and its object is always going to be in the genitive case. But there's another preposition, pros. It means to, towards, or with, and its object is always going to be in the accusative case. Okay, so when you memorize these words, you need to memorize the case of their object. So you'll memorize apa takes the genitive, it means away from. Pros means to, towards, with, its object is always going to be in the accusative. So in your memory work, you're going to keep these things together. Okay, these are the easier prepositions. Now the twist in Greek prepositions is that there are some prepositions who can take cases in take objects in more than one case. So for example, meta is one of them. And you're reading along and you come across the meta, and what you have to do in essence is put your finger on meta and go look for its object. It'll be pretty close to it. And if the object of meta is in the genitive, then you come back and you translate meta as with. But if you're reading along and you hit see meta, you put your finger on it and go look for its object, and its object is in the accusative case, then you come back and you translate meta as after, not with, but after. So the way you're going to memorize these words is that meta with the genitive means with, and meta with the accusative means after. They can be really different meanings depending upon the case of its object. So that's a kind of the funny little twist. Now there actually are some prepositions that can take objects in all three cases, and then you have to memorize three different sets of definitions. But anyway, that's the kind of twist in Greek prepositions. Okay, let me say just a few more things about prepositions. The first has to do with memorization. These things can be a little difficult at times because when they're short, it's kind of hard to get a mnemonic device to help remember them. But the most important thing you can do is, as you're making your flashcards for these different prepositions, is that you always put the case with it. So you'll have apa, and on the back side it should say away from with the genitive. But if the preposition can be followed by an object in more than one case, let's say meta, you would need to have two flashcards. So on the front it would say meta with the genitive, flip it over, it's with. And a second card would say meta with the accusative, flip it over, and it says after. So as far as memory work is concerned, you almost have to treat these as different words. They're not, but you need to keep them separate that way. Now in the textbook, there is a graphic representation of some of the prepositions, those that have a spatial meaning, and maybe that chart or graph will help you memorize the meanings as well, but you can check that out. Okay, that's it for memory work. Keywords. I taught you to use keywords, especially with the genitive, but also the dative. And when it comes to prepositions and their objects, you do not use keywords. In other words, if you were reading along and you saw apa theou, you would say apa means away from, and theou's in the genitive, and so you might want to translate away from of God and stick that keyword in there. Don't do that, all right? Theou is in the genitive not because it's indicating the idea of, but rather it's tied into the meaning of the preposition apa. So when it comes to objects or prepositions, don't worry about keywords, all right? All right. Third thing about prepositions, there's no inflection in prepositions. Yay! These things are not going to change the form based on meaning or function in the sentence. That's nice. However, if the preposition ends in a vowel, it is possible that the end of the preposition is going to be modified. When we say the indefinite article in English, we'd say like a ball. But what do we do if the word after the indefinite article starts with a vowel? See, we don't say apple because that's hard to say. We put an N on the A and we say an apple. Okay, it's just to help with pronunciation. Well, that's what's going on in prepositions. If a preposition ends in a vowel, and if the next word begins with a vowel, it's possible that that final vowel on the preposition will drop out. It's called elision. And that it's going to be marked with an elision mark. It looks just like an apostrophe. So, for example, let's say you saw the expression meta auton. You can't say meta auton with that unnatural pause in there. So what happens? The alpha on the meta drops off, and you say met auton. You can hear how much easier that is to say. Say it yourself, okay? Say it with the alpha, meta auton. Okay, you don't like that pause, a hiatus. And so you drop off the alpha, and it says met auton. So that's just an example of elision. The other thing that can happen, though, with some prepositions is something called aspiration. If you take the expression, the preposition meta, and you follow it with heimon, okay, you add that initial eta, so it's a vowel, and the alpha is going to drop out. But then you have met heimon. Try to say that to yourself out loud with the rough breathing. It's hard, isn't it? Met heimon. So what happens? The tau aspirates to a theta, and it goes to methheimon. So the basic rule is if you have a preposition ending in a vowel and the next word begins with a vowel, it's possible for that final vowel in the preposition to drop. And if you're left with something like a tau and the next word begins with a vowel and a rough breathing, that tau is going to go to a theta. Again, they're just pronunciation things. Now, don't be scared about this. When you get to the vocabulary, I'll show you these forms. In other words, when you see meta, it'll say meta and give its meaning, and then in parentheses, it'll give you the forms met and meth. So I'm just showing you this is one of those prepositions that can drop that final vowel, okay? All right. So that's it for prepositions, except for a piece of parsing information. And this is just a hint. You don't have to do this, and check with your teacher to make sure that he or she wants you to do it. But here's how I've taught students in the past. I want them to connect the preposition with the case and the object. And so what I do is, let's say we had the expression apotheu. We'll stick with that one, apotheu. If I asked a student to explain apa, I would expect to hear not just away from. I would expect the student to say, apa with the genitive means away from. Now, apa only takes a genitive, so it's not that big of a deal. But if you get into the habit of it, then when you come to a meta construction and the teacher says, okay, what does meta mean? Well, meta with the accusative means after. You can see where that's important. Now, if you flip this formula and the teacher asks you, why is theou in the genitive? What I recommend is that you respond with this formula. You would say theou is in the genitive because it is the object of the preposition apa that takes the genitive. So that's my little way of doing that, and I would encourage you to do that as well. Okay? All right, that's it for prepositions. Let's go to the next topic, which is the topic of dependent clauses. What's a clause? Well, a clause is a unit of words that contain both a subject and a verb, and the clause is going to have a meaning. It's going to stick together. But it's a unit of words that has both a subject and a verb. And there's two kinds of clauses. There's an independent clause, and an independent clause can stand on its own. In other words, it's a sentence. So I could say, my name is Bill. That's an independent clause. It's a sentence. It makes sense by itself. I can say, I live in Washougal. Independent clause makes sense. I can make a compound sentence out of it, and I could say, my name is Bill and I live in Washougal. There you have two independent clauses. But that's what an independent clause is. There's a subject, I, and a verb, live. I live in Washougal. And it makes sense by itself. It can stand on its own. Well, there are also things called dependent clauses. And a dependent clause is still going to have a subject and a verb, but it's not going to be able to stand on its own. It's not going to make sense all by itself. It won't make sense. And it's this distinction between dependent and independent is very important as you start breaking a Greek sentence into pieces and trying to make sense of it. Now, a very common dependent clause is something we're going to meet in chapter 14. They're relative clauses, something like the man who is standing by the window is my Greek teacher. See, who, that's your relative pronoun, who is standing by the window is a dependent relative clause. It doesn't make any sense all by itself. You can't say who is standing by the window unless it's a question, and then it's not a relative clause, but we'll with chapter 14 for that. But that doesn't make sense by itself, does it? So it's a dependent clause. All right. What's going on, and why are we talking about clauses? We learned a word in a previous lesson called haughty. That's since or because, right? And we're going to learn another word in this chapter, hina. And hina means in order that, or just that. And what you need to understand is that haughty and hina both introduce dependent clauses. In other words, whenever you see a haughty or whenever you see a hina, you know that you have a clause following it, but that clause is going to be a dependent clause. It's not going to be able to grammatically stand on its own. It's dependent, okay? So take haughty, for example. If I were to say, because I am the teacher. See, that's a dependent clause, isn't it? Doesn't make sense all by itself. Or take hina. If I say, in order that I learn Hebrew. And maybe you're wishing you were learning Hebrew right now, but we're not. We're learning Greek. But if I said, anyway, in order that I learn Hebrew, see, that's a hina clause, in order that, but it's a dependent clause. It doesn't make complete sense by itself. It's not a sentence, right? So haughty and hina are always going to be introducing dependent clauses. Now, here's the other point. Because they're dependent clauses, they will never contain the main verb in the sentence. It's frustrating, not frustrating, but it's one of the things that I've seen happen a lot in class is that students will be translating along and they'll be inside a haughty or a hina clause. They'll see a verb and they'll go, oh, okay, this is the main verb of the sentence, and then they try to translate the verse around that assumption. Well, that assumption is always wrong. Okay, the verb that you're going to find in a dependent clause is never the main verb in a sentence. So what you do whenever you see haughty and hina, you draw that slash mark in front of the haughty or hina, and then you go looking for the end of the clause, and then you draw your other slash. All right, very important to do this because you want to be able to look at these dependent clauses as units of meaning. And as we get further into Greek, what you're going to do is you're going to translate them as a unit of meaning, and then say, okay, how does it tie into the rest of the sentence? So really important that you understand haughty and hina always introduce dependent clauses, which means they will not contain the main verb in the sentence. Okay? All right. Third topic, and this is eimi. Eimi. Eimi is the Greek verb for the English to be, so is, all those words. It is a quite irregular verb. It is technically not irregular, but it's really different from all the other verbs in Greek. It's a very, very common word, and that often goes hand in hand with languages. I don't know why, but the more common something is, the more irregular it tends to become. Language is always simplifying. But anyway, so eimi is the Greek verb to be. I am, you are, he is. Now, let me tell you why I'm talking about a verb here. You know, verbs aren't officially introduced or in length until chapter 15. But what happened is that in making a workbook, I kept coming across really good sentences, or fragments of sentences, or whole sentences, and they kept having eimi in them. And I kept losing all these great exercises to put in the workbook. And I finally said, if they learn eimi, it's not that hard. They can learn it now. I can get better exercises. And I also think it's just good didactically to kind of drop a few hints before you get to the full topic. So we're going to learn some things about verbs now. So when you get to chapter 15, not everything is going to be brand new. So, but that's why we're talking about Amy. Let me review a couple things about verbs I've hinted at earlier, just to make sure they're really clear. We have three grammatical persons in language, in Greek and in English. First person, second person, and third person. First person is the person speaking, so that's I in the singular and we in the plural and all its other forms. Second person is the person spoken to, which is you, and in English we use you for both singular and plural. And then there's third person is that which is spoken about, or as I prefer to say, everything else. If it's not first, if you're looking at something and wondering, is this first, second, or third? Well, if it's an I or a we, it's first. If it's a you, it's second. If it's anything else, it's a third. But he, she, it, they, boat, book, class, those are all considered third person. Okay, so there's three persons. And what happens in a verb then is that, and I don't think I used this word earlier, but verbs have to agree with their subject. Now what that means is that verbs have a linkage to help you identify which noun is doing the action of the verb. Now in English, it's all word order, right? You see a verb, you wonder who's doing the verb, you look at you find a noun or a pronoun in front of it, and you know, okay, that's what's doing the action of the verb. Well, word order doesn't work that way in Greek. And you can put subjects in lots of places, before the verbs or after the verbs. Now we know one kind of linkage already, don't we? That one of the linkages is that the subject is put in the nominative case. Okay. But there's a second kind of linkage where Greeks hook the verbs to their subject. And it's this issue of agreeing. In other words, we say the verb agrees with its subject in person and in number. In other words, if the subject is first person, the verb has to indicate that it's first person. If the subject is plural, the verb has to indicate that its subject is plural. So how does it do this? Okay, if you take a verb in very basic points, there's a stem of the verb that has the basic meaning, and then we stick suffixes onto the end of the verb. Those suffixes are called personal endings, and it's the personal endings that are providing the linkage to identify the subject. So when you see a verb, and you may be reading along and see a nominative, and it may or may not be the subject of the sentence, and what you need to do is you find the verb, and then you look at the ending and saying, is this a first, second, or third person singular ending? Or is this a first, second, or third person plural ending on the verb? That will be the other linkage to indicate, oh, this word is the subject. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what agreement is. You got a stem of a verb, we're going to stick personal endings on the end so that we can identify in the very form of the verb itself what noun or pronoun is the subject of the verb. Now, I say all that because I want to show you this paradigm. This is the paradigm of a me. This is very typical verbal paradigm. First, second, and third person singular, followed by first, second, and third person plural. So basically what this means is, let's say the subject is I, it's ago. And you come to the verb and you want to say am, but you have to make the verb first person singular because ago is first person singular. So you use the form a me. But let's say the subject of this verb is autos. Let's say it's he. Well, autos is a third person singular, and so you wouldn't say a me, you would say estin. Okay? So a me is I am, a is you are, estin is he is, she is, it is, and then you have the plurals. You see how that works? So this is the present form of a me, and you can see how it has different persons and different numbers because the verb's agreeing with the subject. Before we leave this chart, notice the nu on the end of estin and a sin. Okay, technically those nus are not actually part of the verbs. They're called nu movables, and Originally, they were devised to help with pronunciation. So the idea is if you had a verbal form that ended in an iota, it wouldn't have to actually be a verb. This happens in nouns too. If you have a form that ends in an iota and the next word begins with a vowel, it's hard to say. And so they stuck the nu onto the end of the word to make the pronunciation easier. What's unusual in Greek is that when it comes to estin and asin, in every case except once in the New Testament, that nu is there. So in other words, they started using the nu even when the following word didn't begin with a vowel. So except for that one occasion, just go ahead and memorize these forms as estin and asin. All right? All right. There's another form of ame that I want you to memorize, and it's the form ain. This is actually the past time form of ame, and it's the third person singular form. So ain means he was, she was, or it was. And if you think about, well, why I have to memorize this form, you can probably guess, because I kept finding really good workbook exercises that had ain in them. So I figure, well, you learned ame, you might as well learn ain, okay? So that'll be just given to you as a vocabulary word, and you can use it there. Accents. You'll be reading along and you'll see ame, and sometimes what you're going to realize is that, hey, there's no accent on this word. What's going on? Maybe Mounce just forgot to stick it in there, but you'll see it over and over again. Well, ame is a very special kind of word called an enclitic. And we don't talk much about accents, but this is helpful. Ame is an enclitic. And what that means is that it was pronounced with the following word. And so it's like the accent's lost to the next word. So when there's no accent on ame, it's not a typo. It just means it's being pronounced closely with the next word, and the next word's going to have the accent. Now, you may be wondering, okay, that's interesting, but why all the talk about predicate nominatives? Well, this is why. We had to talk about predicate nominatives because just like the verb in English takes a predicate nominative, so also ame takes a predicate nominative. There actually are a few other verbs in Greek that take predicate nominatives too, but we'll deal with that later. Whenever you come across of ame, estin, asin, any of these forms, it's not going to be followed by a direct object in the accusative because ame is not an action verb. It's a stative verb. It's drawing an equal sign. He is Jesus. Okay, he in the nominative, is, estin, the equal sign. Jesus, the Jesus, is going to be in the nominative because it is a predicate nominative. So that's why we had to talk about all those predicate nominatives. Okay, we're almost done here. Let me just cover a few other things. Translation hints, I've already talked about this, but on hati and hina clauses and on prepositional phrases, make sure you're drawing your slash in front of the preposition or hati and hina. Go to find the end of the phrase or the clause and draw your slash and view it as a unit. Okay, it's very important. That'll help you. I'm always big on, when it comes to translation, especially longer sentences, you got to break them up into manageable chunks. And this is one way to do it. The other thing that I need to mention in light of the workbook exercises that are coming up is that one of the peculiarities of a prepositional phrase in Greek is that the object will often lose its article. In other words, you would see, if you saw the Greek for into the lake, not always, but often, there's not going to be the article the. It's just in Greek going to say into lake, okay, eis thalason. And you can't say into lake in English. You have to say into the lake, all right? So this is one of those unusual circumstances where even if there's not an article in Greek, you're probably going to have to put it back in to make sense of your English. And that's okay to do so. Okay. In fact, what happens sometimes is when you get a prepositional phrase in Greek where the article is in front of the object, sometimes you kind of scratch your head and go, I wonder why that was included. I wonder what it's saying. But prepositions anyway. Okay, well, let's go to our summary and see what we've learned in this lesson. We learned about prepositions, words that show the relationship between two other words. They can be spatial, but they can also denote other kinds of relationships. They will be followed by their objects, and The object can always be in the same case for some prepositions, but other prepositions are going to take their objects in 2 or even in 3 cases, and you have to look at the case of the object before you can translate the preposition. And then that whole ball of wax, the preposition and its object and its modifiers, is called a prepositional phrase. You don't use the keywords when it comes to translating the object of a preposition. You just let the meaning of the preposition carry through. Prepositions are not inflected, but they can be elided and aspirated. When the preposition ends in a vowel and the next word begins with a vowel, and in the case of aspiration, a rough breathing. And don't be surprised to find the article omitted in Greek prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrases and hoti and hina clauses are all dependent constructions. They will not contain the main verb in the sentence. And we learned a me. We reviewed issues of person. We talked about agreement. And you need to go ahead and just memorize those 6 forms. And then realize that when you see them, they are going to be followed by a predicate nominative, not by an accusative. Before we go to the vocabulary, I want to give one final plea, and I don't remember if I've said this before or not, but please use your workbook as a test. Read the textbook, watch the videos, do your memory work, get ready, then shut it all up, go to your workbook and do the best job you can. If you get stuck, go on. Don't get stuck and stay there, but just go on to the next one. When you're all done, go back if you need to, reread the chapter or skim it or whatever, and then go back again, shut your textbook and do the workbook. So it's really important that you treat the workbook as a test, because if you're always if you're doing the workbook with your textbook open, you're not going to really be learning what you need to learn. So please treat the textbook as a treat your workbook as a test. Okay, let's move on to the vocabulary for this chapter. Allah, but, yet, except. Apa, with a genitive, from or away from. Dia, with a genitive, through, with the accusative, on account of. Ami, I am, exist, live, am present. Ek, with a genitive, from, out of, also pronounced ex. Hemera, hemeris, hey. Day. Ain, he, she, it, was. Thalassa, thalasses, hey. Sea, lake. Thanatos, thanatu, ha. Death. Hina, in order that. Ioannes, Ioannu, ha. John. Lego, I say, speak. Meta, with the genitive, with the accusative, after. Oikia, oikias, hey. House, home. Oikos, oiku, ha. House, home. Achlas, achlu, ha. Crowd, multitude. Para, with the genitive, from, with the dative, beside, in the presence of, with the accusative, alongside of. Parabole, paraboles, hey. Parable. Pros, with the accusative to, towards, with. Hupa with the genitive by, with the accusative under. This is a really cool chart. If you add up all the word occurrences in the Greek New Testament, and then you take all of your vocabulary and find all the times those words occur, you now know 51% of all the word occurrences in the Greek New Testament. In other words, if you pick up a Greek Bible, you theoretically know every other word that you're going to see in the Bible. So it doesn't take long to get to half. It takes a little bit longer to get to 3/4, but we got to half pretty quickly. So that's an encouraging thing for you. So anyway, that's chapter 8, and have fun. Well, welcome to chapter 9. And in chapter 9, we're going to be looking at adjectives. And like the previous chapter, this is not a really long chapter. It's not a real hard one. And actually, a lot of adjectival grammar that I need to cover with you, you already know because of the article and what we've done with that. So you're not going to find a whole lot of new stuff in this chapter, so that's nice. All right, what's an adjective? Well, an adjective is a word that modifies another noun or pronoun. Adjectives can also modify other adjectives. So, for example, you have the tall teacher. Tall's an adjective. You have the short dog, and short's an adjective. You could have the dark red apple. And dark is an adjective modifying the adjective red. Red is an adjective modifying the noun apple. Okay, so the dark red apple. So that's what an adjective is. It's simply a word that's modifying another noun or pronoun, and adjectives can modify adjectives. There are 3 basic types of adjectives, and the first is called an attributive adjective. Now, this is by far the most common use of adjectives in both English and Greek. But the attributive adjective is very, very common. And all that an attributive adjective is doing is that it's giving an attribute of the head noun. The head noun is the noun or pronoun that the adjective is modifying. So if it's functioning as an attributive adjective, it's giving an attribute. It's giving a quality. It's telling you something about that head noun. So for example, if I were to say, he studied ancient Hebrew. Okay, ancient is your adjective. It's defining an attribute of the head noun Hebrew. It's not modern Hebrew, it's ancient Hebrew. Okay, so that's the most common uses of adjectives as an attributive adjective that's giving an attribute or a quality of the head noun. A second way in which adjectives are used, though, are as substantives, as the substantival use of an adjective. And this is simply when we have an adjective and it's functioning as if it were a noun. Okay, so the old movie, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay, well, those are all adjectives. Good, bad, ugly are, in terms of their form, are actually adjectives. But they're functioning as a noun, so they are substantival adjectives. Or perhaps the old expression, and I guess it's not old, out with the old, in with the new. Okay, old and new are both adjectives, but they're functioning as if they were nouns. So adjectives can be both attributive and they can be substantival. There's a third category of adjectives called the predicate adjective. Now, some people prefer not to talk about a predicate adjective. They prefer to talk about an adjective in the predicate position. So check with your teacher, but the textbook presents this as a third kind of adjective. Remember what predicate means? A predicate means when you divide a sentence into its larger chunks, the predicate is the verb and what follows. So a predicate adjective is an adjective that's following the verb, but the important thing is that the verb is. It's the verb to be. So when you have an adjective that's following the verb to be, we call that a predicate adjective. And what you're going to find out in Greek is that we do the same thing, but the verb is doesn't have to be expressed in Greek, and it gets kind of interesting. But so, for example, if I said, she is young. She is the subject, is the stative verb, and so young is an adjective that's in the predicate position. It's following the verb is, and so we can call it a predicate adjective. All right, so that's enough English grammar for verbs. Let's get into Greek and take a look at this paradigm. Now, the first thing you may notice is there's 3 columns here. What's going on? Because with nouns are either masculine or they're feminine or they're neuter. But for a reason we're going to talk about in just a bit, adjectives have to occur in all 3 genders. And so we have a masculine form for an adjective, a feminine form for an adjective, and a neuter form for an adjective. But now that shouldn't be that new to you because you've already seen that, haven't you? Where have you seen this? We saw it with articles, right? Articles occur in all 3 genders. And so just like an article, adjectives likewise have to occur in all 3 genders. But if we take a look at these, the nominative singular is agathos, agathē, agathon. And the genitive singular is agathou, agathēs, agathou. Dative is agatho, agathē, agatho. And the accusative singular is agathon, agathēn, agathon. So you can get an idea of what's going on there. And by the way, when we talk about lexical forms of adjectives, the lexical form for a noun is the nominative singular, whatever gender it is. But the lexical form for an adjective, because it can occur in all 3 genders, is the masculine nominative singular. Okay? Well, let's take a look at the plural then. And in the plural, it's agathoi, agathai, agatha, agathon, 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 agathois, agathais, agathois, agathus, agathas, agatha. By the way, before we leave this screen, notice the 2-1-2. Okay, this means that agathos is a 2-1-2 adjective. It means there's 3 different forms for the 3 different genders. The masculine follows second declension, the feminine follows first declension, and the neuter follows second declension. That becomes especially important in just a little bit. Okay, that's it for the forms of an adjective. Let's talk about the functions of the Greek adjective. And obviously, their functions are going to be a lot like the English adjective and how it functions. Otherwise, I wouldn't have covered it. All right, what are the functions of a Greek adjective? Well, first of all, most Greek adjectives are attributive. Most Greek adjectives are attributing something of the head noun. They're describing, limiting, clarifying something of the head noun. Now, when an adjective is functioning this way, when an adjective is giving an attribute of the head noun, what do you think determines its case number and gender? Rather than just having something else to memorize, just use your common sense because you know the answer to this. When an adjective is functioning as an attributive adjective, when it's telling you something about the head noun, what determines the case number and gender of that adjective? Well, what determines the case number and gender of the article when it modifies a noun? Well, it agrees, doesn't it? The article agrees with the noun it modifies in case number and gender. And in the same way with adjectives, an adjective functioning as an attributive adjective is going to agree with the noun it modifies in case, number, and gender. Straightforward, right? Kind of common sense. So if you came across like ha agathos logos, you look at logos and it's a nominative singular masculine, and so the article ha and the adjective agathos likewise have to be a nominative singular masculine. So that's real straightforward for attributive adjectives. I should say that provides a nice double check, by the way. If you're reading along and you see an adjective and you think it goes with a noun, you can kind of stop for a second and go, wait a minute. If this adjective is modifying this noun, then it's going to have the same case number and gender. Oh, it does. Yeah, they go together. So good double check. So adjectives can function as an attributive. Secondly, Greek adjectives can also function substantively. They can function as if they are nouns. And so what do you think would determine the case of an adjective that's functioning as a noun? Just think about it. If an adjective is functioning as if it's a noun, what determines its case? Well, just like the noun, the case of the adjective is going to be determined by its function in the sentence. So for example, if you're using agathos and it's functioning as a substantival adjective and it's functioning as a subject, it's going to be in the nominative case, right? But if agathos is functioning as a noun and it's the direct object, it's going to be in the accusative case, right? So when an adjective is used substantively, its case is determined by its function in the sentence. Now, how are you going to determine the gender and number of an adjective used substantively? Again, it's not something to learn. You just got to think through what would make sense. If you were going to say good and you had to determine its gender and number, what would determine it for you? Well, it would be whatever it's standing for, right? It'd be what it's kind of like it's a pronoun. It's whatever it's standing for. It's not a pronoun, but if a pronoun refers back to me, you're going to say he, not she. Okay, so if you have agathos and it's referring to a single male, you're going to use the masculine singular, aren't you? And you can say agathos. But let's say you came across and you saw agathae, feminine. What do you do with it? Well, it's referring back to a single entity, which is female, and so you would understand why its gender is feminine, because it's going back to something that is feminine, that is female. So when it comes to, we're going to come back to this in just a bit, but that's all I need to say for right now. But so when it comes to adjectives being functioning substantively, as you would expect, their case is determined by function. Their gender and number are determined by what it's referring back to. Okay? All right. And I should say, too, what will happen is when adjectives are used substantively, you may find that you have to add in words. For example, to go back to the illustration of agathae, if you saw agathae and just translate it good, the fact that agathae is feminine might not come through in the simple translation of good. So you may need to see, depending upon the context, you may need to say something like the good woman or whatever fits the context. So when adjectives are functioning substantively, you can be a little freer at translating. You may have to add in extra words. The third situation is, third function, is when adjectives are functioning as a predicate adjective or functioning in the predicate position. And in Greek, the important thing here is that sometimes a me is going to be expressed. At other times, a me is not going to be expressed. There's not going to be any a me. And you're going to see an adjective, and for a reason we're going to talk about in a second, you'll realize that it's in the predicate, even though a me is not expressed. And so, again, you have to be careful in your translation. For example, let's say you came across and you saw ha anthropos agathos. Well, you would go, the man good. Oh, that's kind of weird. What do I do with that? Well, in this particular case, agathos is functioning as a predicate adjective. It's in the predicate position. And so you're going to be able to supply is. The man is good. So those are the three functions of adjectives, as an attributive and as a substantival and in the predicate. Okay? All right. The key then is recognition. How do you recognize whether the adjective is functioning as an attributive, substantival, or a predicate adjective? And the whole key here is the article. It's one of those situations I said earlier that the article is your friend. It really is your friend. It's going to help you make this decision as to whether the adjective is attributive, substantival, or predicate. And the guidelines I'm going to give you are precisely that, guidelines. There's some flexibility in Greek about this, but these are the general truths, okay? All right. I need to make sure you know two words, and they are articular and anarthrous. If I say that a construction is articular, it means that the article, ha, is present. If I say that a construction is anarthrous, it means that the article is not present, okay? So those are two important grammatical terms. I can't remember if I've used them yet in the grammar or not, so there. Let's take that first situation, the articular situation. Let's say you're looking at an adjective and the article is present. Okay, that's your clue. And by present, I mean the article is immediately, not somewhere else in the sentence, but the article is immediately before the adjective. Okay, that's an articular adjective. Well, let's look at these. One option could be that the article is indicating that the following adjective is an attributive. And so, for example, if you were reading along and you saw ha agathos anthropos, you would translate it the good man. Okay, the article right in front of agathos is telling you that agathos is in the attributive position and it's modifying the noun. Now, there actually are basically two positions for adjectives. The first attribute, I should say, for the attributive adjective. The first attributive position is this: article, adjective, noun. Or I'd really prefer you to learn it as article, modifier, noun. What we're going to find later on is that there's other things that can modify nouns. So just get into your head. The first attributive position is article, modifier, noun. Ha, agathos, anthropos, the good man. Okay? Well, there is a second attributive position, and it is article, noun, article, modifier. Okay? So if you were reading and you came across ha, anthropos, ha, agathos, the man, the good, that second article actually has no translatable meaning. This is one of the problems that people have when they look at interlinears and they see articles that aren't translated. They go, oh, you should translate all the words. Well, not all words have meaning that can be translated. In this second attributive position, article, noun, article, modifier, the second article has a purely grammatical function, and it's simply telling you that the following modifier, the following adjective, is in the attributive position and modifies the preceding word. So, ha anthropos, ha agathos, the man that good, would be translated the good man. Now, there are nuances of difference between the first and second attributive positions, not something that we need to deal with right now. Okay, but the key is the article immediately in front of the adjective? And if it is, then the adjective is probably in an attributive position, and you're going to translate it as a regular adjective. Okay. Now let's look at another scenario. We're still under the general category of articular constructions. Let's say you came along and you saw ha agathos. You translated the good. Go, wait a minute, where's the noun? You're looking all over for this noun. Where's the noun? Well, that's your clue. The clue is that if you have an articular adjective, and the adjective doesn't always have to be articular, but it often is. If you find an articular adjective with no noun to modify, you probably best bet is that the adjective is functioning as a noun. It's functioning as a substantive. So if you just saw agathos, you would end up translating it the good, and you'd go on with your sentence. The good is. And again, you look at that and you go, is that English or is that not? And if it's not good English, you may need to add in a word. And that's generally okay with most teachers. Okay, there is a third scenario under the articular heading, and that has to do with predicate adjectives. If you're reading along and you find an article with a noun, and then you find an adjective that's anarthrous, there's a pretty good chance that the adjective is a predicate adjective. So, for example, if you saw ha anthropos agathos, there is an article with the noun. That's why this is under the articular heading. There is an article with the noun, but the adjective itself is anarthrous. A pretty good chance that that's a predicate adjective, and you're going to have to supply the verb is. The man is good. So those are the three scenarios in which you're going to have adjectives with an article somewhere, and so we call those the articular uses. Now, there is a whole nother use of the adjective called the anarthrous use. And so this is the situation where there's no article anywhere. Let's say you were reading along. I mean, when I say nowhere, I mean not with the noun, not with the adjective. If you were reading along and you saw anthropos agathos, you go, what do I do with this? Well, if it if agathos is telling you something about anthropos, you would translate it something like a good man. And in these situations, try not to use the word the if possible. If you have to use something, use a, all right? And so if you saw anthropos agathos, you would say a good man, or the agathos could be in a predicate position and it's a man is good. And all you do is look at the context and say what works, what fits here, what makes best sense here, and then go with that translation. Okay? So we have the articular use for attributives, substantives, and sometimes with adjectives in the predicate when the subject has the article. And then we have anarthrous uses where there's not a noun, there's not an article with the noun or the adjective, and you just have to go with context and see what makes best sense. Okay? Let me cover just a few odds and ends now relative to adjectives and modifiers. And the reason I'm doing this is that these are coming up in the workbook, so I need to explain them now for you. Odds and end number one. You're going to occasionally come across a construction where you have the article followed by a prepositional phrase. And it's going to feel weird for you. Go, what's the article doing in front of the prepositional phrase? And generally what you have in these situations is article, noun, article, modifier. But in this case, the modifier is not the adjective, it's a prepositional phrase. And what you're going to have to do is to look at it and understand that that article in front of the prepositional phrase has a purely grammatical function. It's telling you that the following prepositional phrase is modifying the preceding head noun. And then in translation, you're going to have to be a little flexible with these because we don't have this construction in English. So you see what's going on in Greek and you go, okay, how do I say the same thing in English? And you do your translation, all right? The example we have in the textbook is tous paides, tous en Bethlehem. Okay, word for word, that means the children, the in Bethlehem. Now, how on earth are you going to translate that? Well, that second tous is simply telling you that the following prepositional phrase is modifying paides, the children, the in Bethlehem. Now, how do we say that in English? Well, we might say the children in Bethlehem, or we might say the children who are in Bethlehem. That's an English style thing. And again, so you have to be flexible in translating these. But the point is that second tous, the one right before the prepositional phrase, is simply telling you that that prepositional phrase is modifying the preceding noun. Okay, so that's important. The other time you can get an article followed by a prepositional phrase is the article is indicating that the prepositional phrase is functioning as a substantive. Okay, so this gets really flexible in translation. The exercise in the textbook is this verse, and it means, word for word, they spoke the word of God, pasin, to all, tois, the, inte oikia, in the house. Okay, they spoke the word of the Lord to all, the in the house. How do we say that in English? Well, it's to all who are in the house, or we say to all those in the house, something like that. Now check with your teacher about how free he or she wants you to be in handling these situations. But you're going to have to be free. You can't say to all the in the house. That's not English, right? Okay, so that's the first odds and end. What happens when you have an article in front of the prepositional phrase? All right? Okay, good. Second odds and end has to do with what are called tu-tu adjectives. When I showed you the agathos paradigm before, I said this is a 2-1-2. In other words, there's three distinct forms for masculine, feminine, and neuter. And in the case of agathos, the masculine follows second declension, the feminine follows first, and the neuter follows second. Okay. We're going to meet another kind of adjective in this chapter, and it's aionios. And when you look at it in the lexicon, it's going to say aionios on. You go, wait a minute, where's the third form? Well, this is a tu-tu adjective. And what that means is that first form is second declension and is used for both masculine and feminine words. And then the second form, the on, is also second declension, but it's used with neuter words. Okay, so 2-2 doesn't distinguish in form between masculine and feminine. Third odd and in has to do with neuter plural subjects. And here's the basic rule. If you have a neuter plural subject, the verb can be singular. Now, it's not always singular, but if you have a neuter plural subject, the verb can be singular. And what's going on when this happens is that by using the singular verb, the author is telling you that he's thinking of this neuter plural subject as a single entity. And so if you saw a flock of geese and you wanted to, if this were all Greek, and you wanted to refer to it, you want to draw attention to the fact there were 23 geese in it, but you wanted to talk about the flock as a whole. If that were a neuter plural subject, you would say is. All right? Now, the trick here is that, remember, we're talking about grammatical gender. We're not talking about natural gender. In other words, you can have words that are grammatically neuter, and we don't really think of them as neuter, but because they're grammatically neuter, you can have this singular verb. Here's a good example of one. In 1 John 4:1, John says, test the spirits and see if they are from God. Okay, the Greek form, if you already memorized Amy, the Greek form translated they are is estin, isn't it? Well, estin is singular. Well, why do we do what they are? Well, spirits, pneuma, is a neuter word. It's referring to the message and the false preachers, but it's using the word pneuma. Pneuma is neuter. In this case, it's neuter plural. And John is thinking about all of these false prophets, these antichrists, together. And so he uses a singular verb, but we can't say test the spirits and say if they is. We have to say they are. Well, however you want to explain it. We have to switch into the plural in English. But that's okay. In Greek, neuter plural subjects can take singular verbs if the author wants. All right. Well, that's it for adjectives. Let's go ahead and take a look at our summary. We learned that adjectives are words that modify nouns or pronouns and can modify other adjectives as well. We saw that when an adjective is articular, and there's a word for it to modify, it's functioning as an attributive adjective. And in the case of an attributive, case number and gender is determined by the noun that it modifies. If you have an articular adjective but no noun to modify, then that adjective is functioning substantively. Case is determined by function, gender and number determined by what it's referring to. If you have an articular noun and an anarthrous adjective, the adjective is probably in the predicate and you're going to have to supply the verb to be. And if there's no article anywhere, then let context be your guide. Try not to use the in your translation, but you're going to have to determine what fits. Is the adjective predicate or attributive? We also saw how you can have an article plus prepositional construction, and that prepositional phrase could be modifying a noun or it could be functioning as a substantive. We saw that adjectives have to agree with their nouns they modify in case, number, and gender. And for some adjective, that means they're going to have 3 different forms. But there are some adjectives that are 2-2, where the same Greek form is used, whether it's masculine or feminine. And finally, we saw that a singular verb can be used with a neuter plural subject. So how are you doing? Are you in the fog? Yeah, well, we're getting further into the book. There's more and more that we have to learn, more that we have to retain. And the interesting thing about language is it's not like you can learn something and then forget it. You've got to keep all this stuff in your head. And if you're looking at this chapter and saying, I'm just blown away, I can't do this, Again, do what I encouraged you to do earlier, march back. How are prepositions? They're making a little sense. How the case of its object is going to vary depending upon what preposition it is. If that's a little foggy, how are you doing with datives and genitives? I mean, if you go back to chapter 6 and 7 at this point, it should be just an absolute piece of cake. Not a problem at all. If the chapter 8 is a little foggy, chapter 9 is foggier still, that's okay. Just keep moving through it. The fog will move with you. But if you look back and you say, I still don't know what a case is, and I can't remember what the dative is, you're in trouble. Not to be an alarmist, but you are in trouble. And so if you're having trouble 2 chapters back, go to your teacher. If you have a TA, if you have friends in the class, go back and get some help. Make sure you keep using my website at technia.com. There's just gobs of stuff I've put up there to help you, especially when there's no one else around to help you. But this is just the nature of the fog. If the fog goes back to chapters 6 and 7, you're in trouble. If its prepositions are a little frustrating because maybe you can't remember them, that's okay. It just takes time for this stuff to sink in for most people. So just keep moving through the fog, okay? All right. Well, let's go to vocabulary. Agathos, agathe, agathon. Good, useful. Agapetos, agapete, agapeton. Beloved. Ionios, ionion. Eternal. Alelon. One another. Apokrythe. He, she, it answered. Doulos, doulou, ha. Slave, servant. Eon, if, when. Emas, eme, eman. My, mine. Entole, entoles, hey. Commandment. Kathos, as, even as. Kakas, kake, kakan. Bad, evil. Mu, my, also pronounced emu. Nekros, nekra, nekron. As an adjective, dead. As a noun, dead body, corpse. Pistos, piste, piston. Faithful, believing. Paneros, panera, paneron. Evil, bad. Protos, prote, proton. First, earlier. Tritos, trite, triton. Third. Well, welcome to chapter 10. In chapter 10, we're going to be learning third declension. We're going to be learning something called the master case ending chart. And we're going to be learning the last 2 noun rules. So this is a watershed chapter in the grammar. And when we're done here, we're going to know all 3 declensions. And we're going to know almost all noun and adjective forms you're ever going to meet. So this is a great chapter to get under our belt. It's a chapter that historically has caused people some concerns. It's been a hard chapter, but especially in the 3rd edition of the grammar, and even in the 2nd, I started finding ways to make it easier and easier. And now, what was for me one of the hardest chapters, most people say, oh, that's no big deal. So if you've been learning Greek before and you're learning it again, and you're coming to this chapter with some fear, don't worry about it. It's not that hard, as long as you've been learning your case endings properly. Okay. Third declension. What are the declensions? Well, first declension are stems ending in alpha or eta. Second declension are stems ending in omicron. Third declension stems are stems ending in a consonant. So it's called the consonantal declension, consonantal stems. And remember, it doesn't matter what declension a word is in terms of its meaning. If a word could be more than one declension, which it can't, but if it could, it wouldn't change its meaning at all. It would just change its form. So we're dealing here with issues of form, not meaning. The reason that some people have struggled with third declension forms in the past is because when you first look at the paradigm, they can look a little scary because they look really different to some people from the paradigms you're used to. And the reason for that is because the stem ends in a consonant and certain things are happening because of that consonant. But if you've been learning your true case endings and what they really are, third declension is not going to be that big of a deal. There are 3 new case endings that we'll introduce for third declension, and some other ones that are slightly different from first and second, but it's not going to be a big deal if you've been learning your true case endings. And so if you're not sure what those case endings are, you should go back and review before you continue. Okay? All right. Let me give you 4 hints. And what I found over the years is that if you can get these 4 hints down, then everything in the rest of the chapter is commentary. Everything else is just how do these 4 hints show themselves in the different paradigms and the different stems. So focus on these 4, okay? And the chapter's not going to be hard. Hint number 1, you've got to pay attention to the stem of a third declension word. And the reason for that is the stem is usually changed in the nominative singular, which is the vocabulary form. In other words, if you think that the nominative singular, the vocabulary form, is the basic form of a third declension word, the third declension is going to be miserable because it's just going to be weird. But what you have to be able to do is to find the stem of the word. And if you can find the stem, you'll understand the third declension is very, very regular. Let me give you an example. There is a word sark, sigma, alpha, rho, kappa. It's a feminine third declension. It means flesh, among other things. And the stem of the word is sark. Now, what is the normal nominative singular ending, like in a word like logos? Well, it's sigma, isn't it? Well, what happens when you put a sigma onto the stem sark? Say it out loud. Well, it's sarks. Okay, don't pause between the kappa and the sigma. Make it smooth. Well, it's sarks, isn't it? Well, how do we write the x sound? We write it as a xi, don't we? You see, the lexical form of this word is sarks, sigma, alpha, rho, xi. And if you think that sarks is the basic form, you're not going to be able to get the rest of the paradigm. But if you know that the stem is actually sark, sigma, alpha, rho, kappa, then the rest of the paradigm is going to be easy. Well, how do you get to the stem? It's easy. You always memorize the genitive singular. In other words, when you're memorizing a vocabulary, you've been doing this for first and second, and it's not been a big deal because they're pretty consistent patterns. Third declension words, it's a really big deal. You're going to memorize this word as sarks with a xi, then the genitive singulars sarkos, kappa, omicron, sigma, and then hey. The hey tells you it's feminine. Here's how you find the stem of any third declension. You memorize the genitive and you drop off the omicron sigma, more about that in a second, and that's your stem, okay? So hint number 1 is you always have to memorize the stems of these words. You'll memorize them when you do your vocabulary work because you'll be memorizing nominative and genitive singular. Sark, sarkos. Drop off the omicron sigma. There's the stem of the word, okay? So you got to know your stems in third declensions. All the other forms in the paradigm are taken off of the stem, not the lexical form, not the nominative singular. Okay. Second hint. Hint number 2 is that whatever happens in the nominative singular also happens in the dative plural. Think what happened to the stem sark. The kappa sigma gets rewritten as a xi, sarks, okay? Well, the reason that the dative plural is going to act like the nominative singular is that the dative plural case ending is sigma iota. Now, I know in first and second declension you memorized iota sigma. Well, just pretend it's the same ending flipped, okay? It's iota sigma in first and second declension. It's sigma iota in third declension. Okay, piece of cake, right? And so, but what's happening is that the sigma is coming up against the kappa. And so the very same thing that happened in the nominative singular is going to happen in the dative plural. So the dative plural form of this word is sarxi, sigma alpha rho xi iota. Okay, but it's the same change, same morphological change is happening in the dative plural. So whatever happens in the nominative singular, kappa sigma going to xi in this case, is going to happen in the dative plural because both case settings start with a sigma. Okay. Third hint. When you have a nu that's followed by a sigma, the nu drops out. In other words, if you try to say nts, that little pause between nts, it's called hiatus, and Greeks don't like hiatus, and they'll do anything they can to get rid of them. And so what they did, they just dropped out the nus. So take, for example, the stem tin, tau iota nu. Go like, for example, to the genitive plural, you get tinon, perfectly regular. But what's going to happen in the nominative singular? Well, you have tin plus sigma. The nu drops out, and the form is tis, tau iota sigma. And this is the vocabulary form you memorize, tis. Okay. Now, if you think that tis is the basic form, then when you get to the other forms in the paradigm, they're not going to make any sense. Okay, because there's no nu in tis. But you got to think, what's the genitive? Well, the genitive is tinas, tau iota nu omicron sigma. Drop off the omicron sigma, you get the stem tin. Okay, you go to the dative plural. What's going to happen? Tin plus c goes to tinsi, goes to tissi. Nus drop out before sigma. So basic morphological change. The fourth hint has to do with the letter tau. And the basic rule is that Greeks did not like to end a word in tau. There was something about a t sound at the end of a word that it didn't sit right with them. And so they drop it out. The side part of the rule is that just like the nu, if a tau is followed by a sigma, the tau drops off as well. Okay, let's take the stem onomat. This is the stem that means name in Greek. Go to the genitive plural, you got onomaton, no big deal. But what happens when you go to the nominative singular, when you go to the lexical form? What is the case ending in the neuter nominative singular? Well, before you answer that, think about the article. The article is ha, hey. It doesn't go to ton, does it, like ergon does? There's no case ending used in the article. Okay, the same thing is going to happen with onomat words. Same thing's going to happen with third declension neuters. There is no case ending in the nominative singular. So you have onomat is going to go to onoma, right? Tau's don't stand at the end, so it drops off. The lexical form is onoma. You will memorize the form as onoma onomatos. See, there's the tau before the omicron sigma, the genitive singular ending. And you're going to memorize from that the stem is onomat. Go to the dative plural, what's going to happen? Tau's drop off before sigma, you get onomacy. Okay? So these are the hints. And like I said, everything after this is just commentary. Everything after this is just a discussion of how these hints play out. You got to know the stem. All the forms of the word are built off of the stem. They are not built off of the nominative singular, off the lexical form. Secondly, whatever happens in the nominative singular is going to happen in the dative plural because both case settings start with sigma. Hint number 3, nus drop off before sigma. Hint number 4, taus drop off when they're at the end of a word or when they're followed by a sigma. Okay? So those are the 4 hints. So let's work through a paradigm and let's see how this is going to work out. And I'm going to start with the stem sark. Okay, this sark, as I said, is the stem that means flesh. And if you could cover up the answers, okay, that it's easier for this process. And if you're looking at your textbook, cover up the answers. And let's just walk our way through this word. I think you'll find that you can figure it out. Well, you're going to have to learn some new case endings, but other than that, you can figure it out. Okay, you're going to memorize the form as sarx, sarkos, hey. Okay, what does that tell you? Well, starting right to left, it tells you it's feminine. Going to the genitive singular, it tells you that the stem is sark, ending in a kappa. And it tells you that the nominative singular form is sarx. Now, you know the true case ending is a sigma. It joined with a kappa. It's rewritten as a xi. Okay? Piece of cake. Go to the genitive singular. What is it? Well, you memorized it as sarkos, so you know it's sarkos. This is the first of the new case endings in the third declension. The genitive singular case ending is Omicron sigma. Now, that's not completely new, isn't it? I mean, where else have you seen a sigma? Well, all right, first declension can use, they always have a sigma in the genitive singular. Graphes and horas, right? So here you got an omicron in front of it, a little different. Now, if you saw sarkos, what is it? Well, if you don't know your memory work, you could look at it and go, well, that could be a nominative singular second declension masculine, right? So how will you know that sarkos is not that, but is a genitive singular from a third declension stem? Memory work. That's the only answer on that one. You could go to sarkos and look it up in lexicon. You're not going to find it. And that would be the clue that's not the lexical form. But in the genitive singular, the case ending is omicron sigma, and it just hooks onto sark, and you get sarkos. Not a big deal. Okay, without looking, what's the dative singular going to be? Well, what was the dative singular case ending in first and second declension? It's an iota, right? Now, we know that in the first and second declension, the iota subscripted. Why did it subscript? Well, because it subscripts if possible. When is it possible? If the preceding letter is a long vowel. Well, if you have a third declension stem, is the preceding letter a long vowel? No, it's a consonant. So you have exactly the same case ending. The iota just doesn't subscript, okay? So you get sarki. But it's exactly the same case ending as lago and hora and ergo, okay? It just doesn't subscript. Same case ending. It's an iota. Okay, what about an accusative singular? Well, this is a new case ending. It's the alpha. And so third declensions in the accusative singular use alpha as their case ending, and so you get sarka. So you would not have been able to guess that. So what's going on in the singular? It's sarx, sarkos, sarki, sarka. Okay? Okay, look at the paradigm, and you can see how that works out. I'm going a little slowly here, but I want you to see that if you know the case endings, this is not hard. There's just some changes going on, but you can do this. Okay, let's switch to the plural. And again, don't look yet. The form, the stem is sark. Okay, there's a new case ending that's used in the nominative plural. It's epsilon sigma. It was always easy for me to memorize epsilon sigma. In English, es is plural for some reason. So in the nominative plural form of sarx is sarkes. Okay? Go to the genitive, it's always on, right? Always. So it's sarkon. All right. Let's get to the dative. As I said earlier, the dative plural ending in the first and second declension is iota sigma. Third declension just flips it. Don't think of it as a new case ending. Just flip the one you're used to. But then you've got a sigma up against the kappa. What happened in the nominative? Kappa sigma go to xi. So the dative plural is sarxi. And the new that's in parentheses in the paradigm is your new movable. And then finally, what's the accusative plural ending? And again, you got to fudge a little bit on this. It's alpha sigma. It's technically a new case setting, but you've seen alpha sigma as an accusative plural ending before, haven't you? Where? Yeah, first declensions. It's graphos or horas. Now, in the case of the first and second declension, the alpha is part of the stem, and the third declension is part of the case ending. But I never had any trouble memorizing alpha sigma as a accusative plural ending because of the connection. So, sarx, sarkos, sarki, sarka, and in the plural, sarkes, sarkon, sarksi, and sarkos. Piece of cake, huh? That's not hard to do at all. So take a look at your paradigm. Make sure you understand what's happening. And for reasons you'll see later on, you need to know the patterns. That's what's so important here. Third declension stems are categorized based on the final consonant. And so kappa stems are all going to behave like sarks, and there's actually more similarities to look at in a bit. But there are a few other categories of stems that you need to be aware of. One of those are stems ending in mot, mu alpha tau. Now, gender is a hard thing in third declension. If just looking at sarks, you can't tell whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter. But there are some patterns, and one of those patterns is all stems ending in mot are neuter. Okay, that's great news, okay? So this is the stem onomot. We learned earlier that it's the Greek word for name. And because it ends in mot, we know it's neuter, even without memorizing it as neuter. Okay, let's walk through the paradigm. What do you think it would be? Well, what is the nominative singular case ending for third declension neuters? Well, it's nothing, isn't it? So you have onomot with no case ending, and taus can't stand at the end of the word, so you go to onoma. Okay, we looked at this. Onoma. You go to the genitive, you stick the same old case ending on omicron sigma, and you get onomatos. Okay? In the dative, you get what? Onomati. Very good. The iota doesn't subscript. And accusative singular, well, because this is a neuter, you know it's going to be the same as the nominative. So it's onoma. Okay? Let's go into the plural. What is the nominative and accusative plural neuter case ending? Well, it's an alpha. And we're used to that from ergon type words, aren't we? And so you get onomata. What's going to be the genitive plural? Well, it's own. It's always own, so it's onomaton. And what is the dative plural? Well, it's C, but what happens to taus before sigmas? They drop out, don't they? And so you get anomacy with a new movable. See, here's what's important with what you just did, if you were able to follow that with me. Instead of just memorizing all these new paradigms, you saw how the true case endings, and the three new ones that we've had to learn, work their way out with kappa stems and in mot stems. And it's just critical because what you're going to find is that there's other words that are like kappa stems. All right? And so the patterns that we learned with sark kind of stems are going to show up in other stems. There's all kinds of sub-patterns in the third declension. And if you're just going to try to memorize all of them, you're going to have a lot to memorize. But if you can see the patterns, it gets much, much easier. Let me do one other category of word, and you'll see what I'm talking about. This is the new stems. These are stems that end in new. And so we'll take the stem tin, tau iota nu. Okay, add on your nominative singular ending, which is a sigma. What's it going to be? Well, it's going to be tis, isn't it? The nu drops out before sigma. And so the lexical form of this word is tis. Genitive singular, tinos, piece of cake, right? Dative singular, got that iota, tini, not a big deal. Accusative singular. It's a case ending for third declensions. It's an alpha. So you go to tina. All right? So it's tis, tinos, tina, tina. What's going to happen in the plural? Well, it's tines, tinon. Now we get the dative plural. What happened in the nominative singular? Oh, the nu dropped off before sigma. You get tisi with a new movable. And in the accusative plural, you get tinus. All right, with alpha sigma. Okay. If you can go through that pattern with me, you're doing great. So you should be really, really encouraged. Let's look at the word haste. Haste is the Greek word for one. I can still remember in first year Greek raising my hand and asking the teacher what the plural form of haste was. After the laughter subsided, she reminded me that one doesn't have a plural. One only has a singular. Oh, one of my dumber questions I asked. Anyway, the word is haste, And it's a 3-1-3 adjective. What that means is that the masculine follows the third declension, the feminine follows the first declension, and the neuter follows the third, 3-1-3. And it gets kind of weird in the nominative singular masculine. If you have the root of the stem of this word is hen, and you add the sigma, the nu drops off, and you get hes. But what happens is something called compensatory lengthening. What happens in Greek sometimes is if you lose something, the word compensates by doing something different. And in this case, the epsilon compensates by lengthening to the diphthong epsilon iota. So the nominative singular masculine form, the lexical form, is hes, and you're not going to be able to look at that and tell it comes from hen. But if you get to the genitive, it's henos, right? Well, you're not going to get from hes to henos. You're only going to get to the henos from the stem hen, right? So you know this word as hes. You know it's from the stem hen. So the the genitive singular is straightforward. It's henos, dative heni, accusative hena. If you switch over to the neuter, you have the stem hen, and what is true of neuters in the third declension, no case ending is used, so you have hen. But you already know what the genitive and dative singulars are because they have to be the same as the masculine, the noun rule. So it's hen, henos, heni, and then you get to the accusative singular. It has to be the same as the nominative singular, so the accusative singular is hen. Did you follow all that? Those are all the noun rules at play. When it comes to the feminine, it simply shifts to a first declension stem, mia, that goes to mia, mias, mia, mion, as you go through the pattern. So that's the pattern for the Greek word for meaning one. All right, a lot of paradigms in this chapter, aren't there? Okay, we now come to, drum roll please, the master case-ending chart. There are things in language learning that if you don't learn them, it's not a big deal. You can get away with it. This isn't one of those things, okay? Master case-ending chart is just, along with the definite article, the chart that you have to know. If you don't know this chart, you're dead in the water. You might as well give up and go learn Hebrew, I guess. But you just got to know the master case-ending chart. You have to know it left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top. But you also need to be able to know every square where there's a nu, and every square where there's a sigma, and every square where there's an iota. It's so important, you all, that you know the master case-ending chart. And, you've maybe been learning these in connection with a preceding vowel or even in conjunction with a paradigmatic word like logos or ergon. But, man, you've got to know these case endings. And you got to know them perfectly. And the reason you have to know them random access is we're at a point now where you're going to see a form that's going to have a nu. And you're going to have to go, okay, nu. Where do the nus occur? And you simply have to know this, all right? So you got to know these things. As you go through the chart, the first column is second declension masculine, then first declension feminine, then second declension neuter, and then a spacer, and then masculine or feminine third declension. And the third declension masculine and feminine forms are usually identical. And then the final column is third declension neuter. All right. So the endings as you go across are sigma like logos, or nothing, or nu like ergon, sigma like tis, or nothing like anima. Okay? Genitive singulars are upsilon, sigma, upsilon, and then a third declension, it's omicron sigma. In the dative singulars, it's blissfully iota all the way across, piece of cake. In the accusative singular, it's nu, nu, nu. And then when you get into the third declension, the ending that you've learned is an alpha, like sarka. But sometimes a third declension form will pick up the nu. And so you need to learn that the accusative singular ending in the third declension for masculine, feminine forms is either alpha or nu. And then in the accusative singular neuter, the case ending is nothing. See how the chart works? All right. Flip over to the plural forms, and it's iota, iota, alpha, swallowing up the final stem vowel. And in the third declension, it's epsilon, sigma, or alpha. The genitive plural is blissfully owned all the way across. The dative plural is iota, sigma in the first and second declension. Flip it with a new movable in the third declension, you get a sigma, iota. And in the accusative plural, it's upsilon, sigma, sigma, or alpha, swallowing up the final vowel. And the third declension is alpha, sigma, or again, an alpha. All right. Those are just critical case endings, and you just have to know them. And what I enjoy doing in class is giving students speed quizzes. In fact, if you go to the online class on the website, there's a downloadable quiz, and all it is the boxes. Nothing's filled in. And what I do with my students, I initially start them, give them 2 minutes, say fill it out. And then I'll give them 45 minutes. And you can get down to 20 seconds. And then if I had a particularly bad night the night before, I might have them fill it out right to left or bottom to top or randomly. Like where are all the news? Okay, where are all the iotas? I'll fill out everything else, that kind of stuff. But, download the form and then just quiz yourself over and over and over again. You just really need to know the master case ending charts. And so you need to go to it. The book does show you what the master case ending chart looks like if you have the preceding vowel. Sometimes the vowel helps certain people memorize the case endings. So, hey, whatever works, it works. But you need to know what those case endings are. So that's the master case ending chart, and you got to know it really, really well. Otherwise, you're going to be memorizing paradigms and reviewing them for the rest of your life. Okay, let's move on, and let me say just a couple things about third declension. Let me give you a couple of hints about third declensions. And I think I've said or alluded to them already. Number one, make sure you memorize not only the lexical form, the nominative singular, but memorize the genitive singular, which will show you the root, and memorize the article. Okay, you've got to do that in your memory work. Secondly, there are not nearly as many gender patterns in third declension as there are in first and second, but there are some patterns, and one of the main ones is mot, and all stems ending in mot are going to be neuter. And third, don't forget about your article. Article is your friend, and the article doesn't give a rip what the declension of the word is that it's modifying. You've got the 24 forms of the article, and those are the forms that are used. They're going to agree with the noun they modify, the head noun, in case, number, and gender. They're not going to agree with them in declension because there is no third declension form of the article. It doesn't care. Where that's really nice is on some of these kind of bizarre third declension forms. See if there's an article in front of it. If there is, you should be able to parse the third declension noun form. Now, don't guess. You need to always figure out why this weird third declension form is the way it is, but the article will help you, and so that's really, really good. Time to learn the last two noun rules. Yay! Noun rule number 7 is called the square of stops. This is a really handy chart to have in your memory. It's going to help you with third declension nouns. It's going to really help you with verbs. In fact, it's going to help you a lot more with verbs than it does with nouns. So make sure you learn it. The chart that I've got on the video is a composite of several charts in the textbook, but it's kind of nice to have it all in one place. Let's talk about it. What's a square of stops? Well, it's called square because you have the square of the 9 consonants in the middle that are in yellow on the video. A stop is a classification of a consonant whose sound is produced by stopping or at least impeding the airflow. That's why it's called a stop. The air just doesn't pour out of your mouth like it does with a vowel, but it's to some degree or another, it's stopped. And they are the stops exist in certain patterns, and that's why it's so important to know this chart. The first pattern are called labials. The 3 labials are P, beta, and phi. In other words, those are 3 consonant sounds that you make by impeding, by stopping to some degree the airflow but you stop them by using your lips. Now, these are the consonants that are hard for ventriloquists to say, but for most of us, we have to use our lips to say these things. So we say P, beta, or phi. We need our lips. Okay. The second category of stops are called velars. And velars are stops that produce a sound by pushing the tongue up against the soft palate. They're also called palatals because of that. The soft palate, the middle part of your mouth. And they are kappa, gamma, and he. Can you feel your tongue moving as it goes up there? The third category of stops are called dentals, because you stop the sound by using your teeth, that your tongue is clicking up against your teeth. Now, it's not technically your teeth, it's clicking your alveolar ridge, the ridge behind your teeth. If your tongue is clicking your teeth, you probably need braces because you've been pushing your teeth out. But anyway, your dentals, sounds you make by using your teeth or the alveolar ridge, are tau, delta, theta. Okay, can you feel that? Okay. You've got to memorize them, first of all, that way. Labials, P, beta, phi. Velars, kappa, gamma, he. Dentals, tau, delta, theta. Now, I have silly mnemonics that I use for these. If you think it's too silly, then don't use it. But when I memorize them, labials, the pie went by. Phew, okay? Now, velars, the cat at the gardener went. And dentals, the top of the door went thud. Okay, if that's silly, find your own way to memorize them. But there's thousands of students that learn them that way. Anyway, the final column on the right-hand side is what happens when any of these consonants are followed by a sigma. If a labial is followed by a sigma, it doesn't care whether it's a P, beta, or phi. It's going to be rewritten as a C. If a velar is followed by a sigma, it doesn't matter whether it's a kappa, gamma, or he. That velar, the velar plus sigma is going to be rewritten as a C. And if you have a dental, doesn't matter whether it's a tau, delta, or theta. If you have a dental that's followed by the sigma, the delta simply drops out, and all that you have is the sigma. Okay, so that's what that final column is about. Now let's look at the headers along the top. In the current printing of the book, I don't think these are actually in the book. What is the difference between a P and a beta and a phi? Well, the last ones are simple. They're called aspirates. You see how as you go down the column, we're doing the same thing to all the sounds. We're aspirating it. And P goes to f, and k goes to f, and t goes to th. Okay, it's like we're adding an H onto the end of the consonant. So the aspirates are straightforward. But what's the difference between a P and a beta? Well, put your fingers gently on your Adam's apple and say a P. Now say a B. P, B. You feel the difference? Yeah, your voice box vibrates when you say the beta. Same with K and G and T and D. All right? That's why they're called voiceless and voiced. Now, where have we seen this already at work? Yeah, we saw it in the nominative singular and the dative plural of stems ending in kappa, didn't we? Sark plus sigma goes to sarks in the nominative singular. Sark plus sigma iota in the dative plural goes to sarksi. So there's an example of this at work. Beta, gamma, and delta use your voice box. It's going to vibrate to help make the sound. And P, kappa, and tau are voiceless. The voice box doesn't vibrate to make the sounds. Okay, this is a really, really important chart, and it's gonna save you just gobs of memory work. Have you noticed by now that I don't like to memorize? Yeah, that's one of the consistent patterns in my life. If I can find a chart and a couple rules, my mind would much prefer to memorize that. So again, these are all these little clues that I'm trying to give you to keep your memory work down. This square of stops is going to save you verbs, all kinds of problems. So make sure you memorize it left to right, memorize it top to bottom, and memorize what happens when you add sigmas, okay? Labials, P, beta, phi, velars, kappa, gamma, he, dentals, tau, delta, theta. When you add sigmas to a labial, they become a psi. Sigma to a velar becomes a xi. And sigma to a dental, the dental drops out. And then the columns are voiceless, voiced, and aspirates. Noun rule number 8. You've already seen this one. Noun rule number 8 is that a tau cannot stand at the end of a word, and so it drops off. So you have the stem anamat. No case ending is used in the nominative accusative singular. It's a neuter word. And so you go to anama. Okay? The tau comes back in the genitive, anamatas, dative, anamati. But it drops off when it's the last letter in the word. Okay, and we come now to pas. Pas is a really important word. It's a word that if you can understand all of its different forms, it means you have a pretty good handle on third and first declension words. But pas is also used as a paradigmatic form for participles in chapter 26 and following, and it's used a lot. And so if you've really got to get pas down, but you should be encouraged that if you can get pas down, then it's third declension is going to be straightforward. It's a word that means all, and you're going to memorize it as pas, pasa, pan, and you're going to memorize that the stem in the masculine and the neuter is pant, p alpha nu tau. Okay, so this is called a 3-1-3 adjective. The masculine follows the third declension, the feminine follows the first declension, and the neuter follows the third declension. Obviously, in the feminine, something has happened significantly different if the stem, in fact, is pant. Well, the stem in the feminine, this happens quite a bit with first declension stuff. The feminine also often reverts back to the first declension. So if you have pasa, it's pasa, pases, passe, pasan. That's a piece of cake. But what I'd like you to do is try to, without looking at the answers, what I'd like you to do is to figure out with me what are the masculine and the neuter forms, okay? Let's just try to figure it out. You can do this, okay? You can do this if you understand what I've been talking about so far. Let's look at the nominative singular. You're going to memorize it as pas. What's the case ending? Well, it's a sigma. But if I tell you that the stem is pant, what happened to the nu tau? Well, both the nu and the tau drop off before sigma, right? We saw that hint. And so pant goes to pas, piece of cake. When you get into the genitive singular, what's it going to be? Well, pantas, not a problem, right? Okay. Omicron sigma case ending, third declension form. It's a third declension stem. It ends in a consonant, right? Tau. What's going to happen in the dative singular? It's going to go to panti, right? And in the accusative singular, it's going to go to, what is it? Panta. Very good. So pas, pantas, panti, panta. That's a piece of cake, right? Okay, flip over to the neuter. If the stem is pant, what happens to neuters and third declensions? Well, by default, what happens? Well, there's no case ending used. What happens to that final tau? Goes away. So that's why we learned the form is pas, pasa, pan. Okay, the newest part of the stem, the tau's dropped off. There's no case ending. What's going to happen in the genitive and dative singulars? Same thing that happens with the masculines, right? That's the noun rule. So it's pan, pantas, panti. And because it's a neuter, what's going to happen in the accusative singular? Same thing that happened in the nominative singular. Pan, pantas, panti, pan. So you should have been, if you can follow that through, and I guess that you can by now, you should be feeling pretty good about yourself. The feminine, as is often the case with third declension forms, is going to revert back to a first declension. I mean, it's often when you have masculine and neuter and third with adjectives, you're going to find that the feminine often goes to the first declension. And the stem in the first declension is pasa, all right? So you just have to remember the rule in does the alpha go to an eta or not? Well, what's the preceding letter? Is it epsilon iota rho? No, so it goes to the eta. So it's passes, eta sigma, pas a, eta iota subscript, and then back to alpha to pasan. Okay, so there's your chart of pas in the singular. How'd you do? How'd you make sure that you understood what I went through? My guess is you probably do. Okay, let's do the same thing in the plural. And again, let's just start with pont and let's see what we can come up with. In the masculine, what's the nominative plural case ending? It's epsilon sigma. Is it going to go straight on the stem? Sure. You're going to get a pontes, piece of cake. What's going to be the genitive plural? Ponton. No surprise. What's going to happen in the dative plural? Well, whatever happened in the nominative singular is going to happen in the dative plural. The dative plural case ending is sigma iota with a new movable. What happened in the nominative singular? We got pos, right? Both the nu and the tau drop off. So the dative plural is posse with a new movable. And then what's the accusative plural? Well, case ending is alpha sigma, so it's pontos. Did you get that? Piece of cake. Let's flip over to the neuter column. What's the case ending? A neuter third declension, nominative plural. It's alpha. So you get ponta, okay? Then the genitive and dative are the same as the masculine, ponton, posse. And the accusative plural is the same as the nominative plural, ponta. All right? Go back to the feminine. It's the first declension, so it's not any trouble at all. Passai, passon, passais, passas. Okay, if you can get that, and you can understand why it's doing what it's doing, you're home free, okay? It's not that hard, is it? Right? You're home free. Now, I should say a couple things about pos, though. Pos is a little bit of a different word. It often functions as a noun, as a substantive. And so it's all the people, all the men, all the women, all the things, whatever. And in the singular, you can't really have all, so it's each or every in the singular. Just look at context. You're probably used to that by adjectives by now, aren't you? Just look at context and see what word you need to use if it's functioning as a noun. The other oddity about pos is if it's functioning as an adjective, it's in the predicate position. In other words, most adjectives, when they're functioning as adjectives, are in the attributive position. That means they're immediately preceded by the article, right? Well, pos and a few other words we're going to be learning a little bit later in another chapter are used in the predicate position when they're functioning adjectively. So there won't be the article ha in any form before pos, but it's still going to mean each, every, or all, and then whatever word it's modifying. We've seen 3 of these 4 categorizations of adjectives, so let me summarize them for you real briefly. Adjectives will fit in one of 4 basic categories. There are 2-1-2 adjectives like agathos, where the masculine is second declension, the feminine is first, the neuter is second declension. There are also 3-1-3 adjectives like we learned with pos, where the masculine and the neuter are third declension, the feminine is first. And we've also seen 2-2 adjectives, ionios, ionion. The masculine and feminine are second declension, and the neuter is second declension. And there's also a 3-3 kind of adjective, and tis is that kind of adjective, where the masculine and feminine are third declension, tis, and the neuter is also third declension. So those are the 4 categorization schemes for adjectives. We're going to hit a couple of uses of the article in this chapter I need to give you heads up on. One is a review, one is brand new. The word in Greek that we call the article ha is not actually the article. Its use in Greek is much, much larger than the English word the. The word ha is categorized as a weak demonstrative. And that's why we can translate ha other than with the English word the. And you're just going to have to wait for context to decide when it has to be translated. It'll be pretty straightforward. You won't be surprised when you see it. Sometimes you're going to be able to translate ha in any of its forms as that. Sometimes you're going to be able to translate it as a relative pronoun, who. But there's one specific situation where you can translate ha as a personal pronoun, as he. And that is when you have ha de. When you have the article ha followed by the postpositive de. When you see ha de, it almost always means but he. Okay, so that's just one of the clues. Ha de, The word ha is functioning as a personal pronoun, and you translate it as but he. And by way of review, let me remind you, and we learned this several chapters back, that sometimes you can have an article in front of a prepositional phrase. Remember that? And the article is substantivizing the prepositional phrase. It's making it function as a substantive idea, as a noun idea. And so, for example, if you had an expression, tois inte oikia, the in the house, that's a noun idea. And you go, well, it'd be those who are in the house, because tois is plural, so you'd say those. If it were singular, you'd say the one who or he who is in the house, something like that. But remember, you can have the article in front of the prepositional phrase, and it will turn the whole prepositional phrase into a noun, and you can be pretty flexible in your translations. So what have we learned in chapter 10? Well, we've learned third declension. And third declension stems are stems that end in a consonant, and they will take third declension case endings. There are 3 new case endings for third declensions and a few changes, but if you've learned the true case endings, it shouldn't be a real problem. When you memorize a third declension word, you always memorize its genitive singular form, and from that you can see what its stem is by dropping off the os, and you always memorize it as all nouns with the article, so you can tell what its gender is. We're going to memorize the master case ending chart perfectly. We're going to learn the square of stops. The labials are the p, beta, phi that go to psi when followed by a sigma. The velars are kappa, gamma, chi that go to xi. And dentals are tau, delta, theta that go to a simple sigma when followed by a sigma. We learned rule 8, that a tau cannot stand at the end of a word and it's going to drop off. We learned 4 different categories of adjectives. We learned that ha can be translated as something other than the, and the expression ha de most likely means but he. And we memorized pas, the paradigmatic form that's so important to know for 313 constructions. So how are you doing? That was a pretty long chapter, wasn't it? Yeah, it's one of the longest ones in the book after chapter 6. You feel like you're in the fog? Okay, look back several chapters. Nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, piece of cake. Prepositions, piece of cake, right? So the fog's just moving with you. It's okay. But you need to understand that chapter 10 is a watershed chapter in the book. You now know all 3 declensions. There isn't a 4th declension. There's only 3. So you know all the declensions. You know actually almost all of the noun forms in the entire Bible. And so not a whole lot more to learn. And the next 4 chapters are really pretty simple, okay? This is the last of the hard stuff, and we're going to breeze through the next 4 chapters and then start verbs. So the fog's with you. Not too badly, I hope, though. And just do your memory work and close up your grammar and do your workbook. Hagios, hagia, hagion. As an adjective, holy. As a plural noun, saints. A, if. A may, except if not. Haste, mia, hen. 1. A day. Now, already. Anima, anamatos, ta. Name, reputation. Udes, udemia, uden. No one, none, nothing. Pas, pasa, pan. In the singular, each, every. In the plural, all. Peri, with the genitive, concerning, about. With the accusative, around. Sarx, sarkos, hay. Flesh, body. Soon, with the dative with. Soma, somatas, ta. Body. Teknon, teknu, ta. Child, descendant. Tis, ti, with the accent. Who, what, which, why. Tis, ti, without an accent. Someone, something, a certain one, a certain thing, anyone, anything. Well, welcome to chapter 12. And in chapter 12, we're going to be learning autos. Now, you already know a lot about autos. You've seen it meaning he and him and his and that kind of stuff. And in fact, probably half of what's in this chapter is going to be a review. And so it's an easy chapter. There's no new forms to know. That's always good. We're going to stick with forms you already know. But it's a pretty basic chapter on just the word autos and how it functions. In terms of English grammar, the only thing we really need to do is to make sure that you're comfortable with the paradigm for the third person personal pronoun in English. Here it is. And so you notice that he is subjective, subject of the sentence, his, him, feminine, she, her, neuter, it, its, it. And notice that when we get into the plural, it's they, their, them. And in English, we don't distinguish between genders in the plural. We use they, whether it's a bunch of men, a bunch of women, a bunch of things, or mixed. We don't care in English. In Greek, we do care. And so that'll be one of the little adjustments you have to make in translation. But we'll see about that in just a second. Okay, let's move on to Greek then and look at the forms of autos. And again, these are forms that for the most part you already know. And so nothing new to learn here. Look at the paradigm. Autos is a 2-1-2 adjective, and so it has a second, first, and second declension endings. No big deal. But a couple of things you need to notice. Notice that it always starts with out, alpha, upsilon, smooth breathing, tau. That may not seem like a big deal right now, but in the next chapter we're going to learn another word that some people confuse with this form. And the way to keep them separate is that autos always begins alpha, upsilon, smooth breathing, tau. The only form, though, that is going to perhaps catch you is the nominative and accusative singular neuter. What's missing? Well, the case ending's missing, isn't it? I mean, we're used to words like ergon that use a nu there. But this is one of the more common sub-patterns for second declension neuters where there is no case ending used. Now, we've already seen that, haven't we? What word? Now, the article. Article's ha, he, ta, not ton. So it's part of the same sub-pattern. So auta, no case ending, is a nominative or accusative singular neuter. Now what this means, and it's really nice, is that the form auton with a nu can only be one thing. What is it? Well, it can only be accusative singular masculine. And so at least that makes life a little easier for you there. Okay, let's move into the uses of autos. There are three basic uses. The first use, and by far the most common, is as a third person personal pronoun. In fact, this is so much the normal use of autos is that when you see autos in any of its forms, you should initially think he, she, it, they. All right? It's just, this is hands down the most common use of autos and the one that you have seen for several chapters now. Let's take a look at the paradigm. When you look at the paradigm, you can see that autos, autu, auto, auton mean he, his, to him, him. Okay, no big deal. And you got the feminine, you got the neuter. When you get into the plural, though, you'll notice that in the Greek, we do distinguish gender. And all that you're really going to have to realize is that fact, because no matter whether it's autoi or autai or auta, in English we say they. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's autus, autas, or auta, we say them. It doesn't, again, matter whether referring to a bunch of men, women, things, or mixed antecedents. We still say they, their, to them, or them. That's just a little adjustment you have to make in the translation of the third person personal pronoun. Well, in this use of autos, then, what determines its form? Well, and this is mostly just common sense. It shouldn't be hard for you. What determines the case of autos? What determines the case of any pronoun? Its function, right? So if autos is functioning as the subject, it's going to be nominative. If it's functioning as a direct object, it's going to be accusative. And just as was the case with ego and su, when autos is functioning as a possessive, it's going to be in the genitive, it's going to be immediately following the word it modifies, and it's going to be an arthrus. So for example, let's say you wanted to say his name. You would write ta anima autu, the name of him, his name. Okay, so that's pretty much straightforward. Well, what determines the gender and the number then of autos when it's functioning as a personal pronoun? Again, it's common sense. What would determine its number? Antecedent. Whatever it's referring back to, is it one or more than one? What determines the gender of autos? Well, for the most part, this is common sense as well. But because of one kind of oddity, I need to break it down into two parts. If the antecedent of autos is personal, then you're going to translate autos following natural gender. There's a Greek word for sinner. It's a hamartolos. It happens to be masculine gender. And so when you have a form of autos referring back to the word for sinner, it's going to be masculine grammatically. And we think, at least now in our current state of English, it's changing. But for right now, we can still refer to generics of this sort as he, the sinner, he. In the plural, you'd say the sinners, they. But again, that's not an issue in English because we don't differentiate gender. We just do in the singular. The other oddity has to do when the antecedent is not personal and when it's in the singular. In the plural, it's no problem because we don't differentiate gender in English. But if the antecedent is not personal and it's in the singular, again, it's just common sense. If you stop and think, you'll be able to figure it out. For example, there's the Greek word for sin. It's hamartia, and it's a feminine noun grammatically. And so when autos is going to be referring back to its antecedent hamartia, then autos has to be in a feminine form. It'd be hamartia aute, okay? But we don't say sin, she, unless you're Ben Sirach, and I'll let you work in your biblical studies to figure out why I say that. We're not going to say sin, she. We say sin, it. But autos will have to be feminine because it's antecedent. Hamartia is feminine. But in English, we refer to sin as an it. If the antecedent were cosmos, and we would therefore, because it's masculine, we would use a masculine form of autos, but we don't say the world he, we say the world it. Okay, so the oddities have to do when natural and grammatical gender don't line up in the singular. Just use your common sense. Greek will be following grammatical gender, but English has to follow natural gender in those cases, okay? That's the first use of autos. The most common use is a third person personal pronoun. The second use of autos in Greek is as an adjectival intensive. Let's say you were reading along and you came across the phrase ha David autos. Well, you would say, okay, David, that doesn't make any sense. And that actually is one of the biggest clues that autos is not functioning as a personal pronoun. You may kind of default to that translation, but it's not going to make any sense. So what do you do with a construction like ha David autos? Well, this is the adjectival intensive use of autos. And teachers are different on this, so you want to check with your teacher if you're in a class. Most people, at least early on in Greek, want you to translate this use of autos with the reflexive pronoun in English. Now, this is over-translating. Greek does have its own reflexive, and by using the English reflexive, it's adding more weight to autos than it really can carry. But in beginning Greek, it's always nice to let your teacher know that you know that autos is there and you need to translate it. So What some teachers will have you do is translate an expression like ha David autos as David himself, Mary herself, the boat itself, whatever be the gender of the head noun. Some teachers, though, because that's such poor English, don't really want you translating autos at all. But just recognizing that if it says ha David autos, that in your preaching, in your teaching, in your term papers or whatever, you would say that David did this. It's adding emphasis. It's intensifying David. David ate the bread of presence. Jesus talks about. So anyway, the adjectival intensive is the use of autos to add emphasis to a word. Some teachers will have you translate it with a reflexive, and that's how I prefer early on. Others don't. This is actually the same situation we have with the nominative singular forms of ego and su. They're both unnecessary because they are contained in the verb. And so when the ego and the su are actually there, there's some kind of emphasis, intensifying action going on. I do this, but you do that. But again, you could say I myself and you yourself, but that's awkward English. So in all these cases, the personal pronouns, first, second, and third in the nominative raises this interesting issue. But for now, I'll just say, use the reflexive, David himself. So how will you identify the adjectival intensive use of autos? Well, we've already seen one, right? And that is, it doesn't make any sense as a personal pronoun. That'll be your first clue. But there'll be a couple of other clues. First of all, autos will be modifying something. When it's used as a personal pronoun, it doesn't modify anything. It has a function. It stands on its own. So if it's an adjectival intensive, it's going to be modifying it, something, another noun. And in that case, its case number and gender is determined by the word it's modifying. So for David himself, David is nominative singular masculine, so you have to use the autos form of the word. Usually, though, and this is the biggest clue, that autos is functioning as an adjectival intensive. In almost every case, autos is modifying the subject of the sentence when it's being used intensively. Okay? So normally what you're going to have up near the beginning of the sentence is you're going to have an express subject and then autos or aute if it's a woman. That's your main clue that this is the adjectival intensive. And the other clue is that it is in the predicate position. It's ha David autos, okay? But the main clue is it's in the nominative, it's modifying the subject of the sentence. Doesn't make any sense as a personal pronoun. Okay, it's probably adjectival intensive, okay? All right. Let me give you just a couple of examples, and this should get really clear. In fact, the exegetical insight for the chapter talks about this use of autos, so you may want to check it out. How would you translate ha Jesus autos? Well, obviously, it's an intensive form. You can't translate autos as a personal pronoun. Doesn't make any sense. So it'd be Jesus himself. Okay, let me give you a slightly harder one. What if it were ha cosmos autos? Autos is masculine. Why? Well, because cosmos is masculine, but we don't refer to the world as a he. We refer to the world as an it. So ha cosmos autos would be the world itself. Okay? Okay, good. If you had aute he ecclesia, I mean, sometimes autos can come before. Normally it comes after the word, but sometimes it can come before. If you had aute he ecclesia, how would you translate it? Well, it depends upon how you refer to the ecclesia, refer to the church, right? Grammatically, ecclesia is feminine, so aute has to be feminine. But you would either say the church itself or the church herself, however you happen to refer to the church and where you are in this whole gender issue in the English language. Okay, a couple examples. One more. If you had su autos leges, how would you translate it? You see, that the subject doesn't have to be third person. It can be first and second. So if the subject were su, you would still have autos. That's going to look kind of weird, but you can see grammatically what's going on. It's you, Well, what's the reflexive for you? Well, how do you add emphasis for you? Well, you say you yourself, okay? So su autos lege would be you yourself says, okay? So the subject that autos is modifying doesn't have to be third person, okay? Very good. So that's the adjectival intensive hat David autos, okay? Okay, the third use, and this is by far the least frequent uses of autos, is as what we call the identical adjective. Let's say you were reading along and you came across ton, auton, logon. How would you translate it? Well, it'd be the, he, it, word. That didn't make any sense. It's articular, so it can't be the emphatic form. So it is the identical adjective. This is the third use of autos. And you would translate ton, auton, logon as the same word. Okay? To identify the identical use of autos is pretty straightforward. First of all, it's not very common. You're not going to see it a whole lot. But it's going to be in the attributive position. It's going to be immediately preceded by the article. And that'll be your main clue. And when autos is functioning this way, as you would expect, it's going to agree in case number and gender with the word that it's modifying. So, ton, auton, logon is the same word. That's the third use of autos, functioning as the identical adjective in the attributive position, and we translate it same. Okay, very good. Short chapter. So what did we learn in summary? Well, we learned that autos is a normal 2-1-2 word. The only oddity is in the nominative and accusative neuter singular. There's no case ending used, and so we have auta, which means that auton is always accusative singular masculine. And we saw that autos has three basic functions. Hands down, the most common is as a personal pronoun. This is what we've been seeing for several chapters now. When autos is functioning as a personal pronoun, we see that its case is determined by function, and that its number and gender are determined by antecedent. And the only thing you have to watch out for is when that antecedent is in the singular and is not personal. You're going to have to use proper English because Greek is going to be following grammatical gender, and it's going to mess you up. We also saw that autos can function as an adjectival intensive. In this case, you for now translate it with the reflexive, himself, themself, yourself, myself. And normally when autos is functioning as an adjectival, it's going to be modifying the subject, and so it's going to be in the nominative, to be in a predicate position. And thirdly, autos can sometimes function as the identical adjective. It means the same. It'll normally be in the attributive position. So, pretty short chapter, and you should be able to get through this exercise quite easily. So, have fun.
Ion, Ionas, ha. Age, eternity. Didaskalos, didaskalu, ha. Teacher. Euthus, immediately. Heos, as a conjunction, until, as a preposition with the genitive, as far as. Mathetes, mathetu, ha. Disciple. Men. On the one hand, indeed. Medes, medemia, meden. No one, no thing. Manas, mane, manan. Alone, only. Hapos. How, that, in order that. Hasas, hase, hasan. As great as many as. Therefore, then, accordingly. Ophthalmos, ophthalmu, ha. I sight. Pollen. Again. Pus, padas, ha. Foot. Huper. With the genitive, in behalf of. With the accusative, above.